And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already. And as usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, kind of hot out there. It's almost summer, Memorial Day kicking in here in Boston. But, you know, it's weird because this week has seen the whole Department of Homeland Security attempt to take over on the UFO file. You got the Davos crowd meeting up. And, you know, I just think about those meetings, the after parties where they're like, I'm going to take over the world. Just try to think of the vibe in those places.
I try not to.
You know, you can feel it. You can feel that end of the spectrum. And, of course, there is a great concentration of wealth and transhumanism and the whole kind of warped political class when we get into the Davos week. So you can feel that, just like when the Bilderberg group, Bilderberg used to be the central feature of this thing. Davos really is it now. And I give Professor Scott a lot of credit for really pointing them out. And, you know, a lot of people started to figure out, oh, these Davos meetings are happening, all this brass are there, all these decisions are being made. But it was really Scott who said, you know, this is so out of step because here you have, you know, the world in such chaos. And you have these kind of latte sipping guys talking about how they're going to, you know, get the war in Ukraine going and all these different things, and how their transhumanism, you know, this is the time. It's the time for us. So they're in for a big wake up call. But of course, we're in the middle of their big clutches. So it's quite a clash, and you can feel that clash in almost everything right now, from culture. Even the comedy is warped. You see a lot of the regular comedy shows.
There is no comedy anymore.
Right. They all have to kind of walk in lockstep with this Davos thing, or they'll get thrown off the Ark, as it were, or out of the bunker. And I said the magic word Ark, of course. That's for Noah's Ark tonight. And we're going into this in such a deep, interesting way because we're going to explore the Noah's Ark aspect through the mystery schools and what it represents, and also the actual happening in the Atlantean period, which is crucial. And there's a lot of mystery school material in relation to this. So this is going to be very, very, we're going to come in from 2 or 3 different angles on this. And, you know, what's interesting and always been kind of fascinating to me is that people have searched for the actual Ark from the biblical Genesis story. Of course, Noah with his family, those 8 souls, go through this incredible devastation, 40 days and 40 nights of rain. And we just have, you know, all the animals there represented 2 by 2 on the Ark. There's so much in that about preservation of knowledge, preservation of civilization, when humanity just gets overcome with this negative entities. And this becomes so important, I think, for us tonight when looking at the situation we're in. Noah's Ark can very much serve as a powerful allegory, historical incident, and mystery school message all together, along with its tremendous societal implications and, of course, religious, spiritual implications as well. What's your impression of the Noah's Ark story? How do you feel about that?
Well, you know, I was raised without religion.
That's true.
So, you know, I got all my stuff from biblical movies.
Not bad. There are some good ones. Well, those movies often start out with, like, you know, Noah getting these messages that this incredible, you know, kind of inundation is coming, and everyone laughing at him while he's building this huge Ark in the middle of everyone else is having a good time. And he knows it's coming. And then when the time comes, he starts to go into the Ark, and everyone's like, hey, let me in, you know. And so the story of Noah and the Ark carries something of the Tower of Babel in it. There are replays of this idea. Sodom and Gomorrah also has a role in this, where God goes to an individual and says something devastating is about to happen, and kind of gives them the message, you're going to be saved if you can get out because you're a righteous person and you have a spiritual understanding. And these other people have allowed themselves to be overwhelmed by material interests. So in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, you have Lot and the angels, and, you know, find me 10 good men ultimately, gone down all the way from 100 good men. And he can't even find 10 good men. So all they find is Lot and his family. And of course, when the angels are there, also the people of Sodom try to kind of get them for perverse purposes, and they strike the whole city blind, which is quite remarkable for the Old Testament. You don't see that kind of action. I mean, you do see the Red Sea and other things, but blinding a whole town, that's pretty remarkable. So we have these echoes in these different stories, and we're going to get into them tonight through the lens of the mystery school allegory, which is preserving that information, preserving that knowledge over time. As we may find with this civilization driving itself over a cliff, there may be groups of individuals who need to help actual civilization survive, while these psychos at the top try and transform you into a cyborg while trying to start a nuclear war over there in Ukraine and Russia, and also try to kind of move into food shortages and what that would look like, and the power of control through that technology, thinking that they have this kind of incredible grip that just won't be able to be unfastened. And yet there are the stories also in the Bible, David and Goliath, for example. David, a 15-year-old shepherd with a slingshot, takes down the mighty giant by hitting him in his weak spot. There's a lot in the Bible. There are a lot of messages laid there, and most of it is completely a mystery document. There's no question about it. And comes directly out of the schools. Of course, the school of the prophets comes out of the Bible, Elijah, and the Essenes, and all the mysticism of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which Jesus and John the Baptist will be a major part of that Essene group, which is steeped heavily in all kinds of mysticism, from astrology and astronomy to numerology and other things. As a matter of fact, when you get into the whole three wise men around the story of Jesus, you've got that whole piece of mysticism of them following a star and so on. And these are master astronomers, the three wise men. And they know something is up when that star, the Star of Bethlehem, appears. In the Noah case, you get a lot of that as well. And so we're going to get into the mystery aspects of this tonight. I wanted to mention, we've been following a lot of different stories, and we've been trying to tell everyone, it's a weird way for this to kind of weave in, oddly enough, but all of our stories in the X series about emergency powers and the continuity of government programs, this also has an aspect of that disaster and seizing power through emergencies. And interestingly enough, the New York Times just released those documents about emergencies and the government's response to them, now sharing this idea publicly. I've been tracking this through for a good decade or so, and people like Professor Peter Dale Scott with the Continuity of Government bringing that out before anyone really had anything on their minds about it. This is the kind of thing you couldn't even mention in congressional session. You were actually sanctioned if you did. So now everyone wants to talk about it in the media, and also as we go further. So, we have Pelosi and people like that. Oddly enough, a story came out on this, which was the New York Times story. Documents shed light on secret plans for apocalyptic scenarios. So they want this out because they want to be able to introduce the emergency power idea, because they're going to need it in order to govern ultimately. When you have approval ratings that are below 30%, you can no longer govern. That's just the way it goes. And so they get into a situation where they need to create a scenario. So we're going to do a full report on these documents that tumbled out strangely to the New York Times. I find the timing very, very unusual, considering Stepford Biden and the disasters that he's presiding over, including a record-breaking inflation and, the war in Ukraine, and the number of just missed opportunities, and also the incredible disaster of Afghanistan and the general fumbling of domestic and foreign policy. So they're introducing the emergency piece now. As we've discussed, this is their main plan. And at the same time, the Department of Homeland Security is moving in the emergency piece through the UFO file. You got to watch those two, because the switch out of the UFO file to Department of Homeland Security is that's the gun, that's the shot that lets you know the marathon is starting. And they've been playing around with this, and now once they moved it over into DHS, it means they want to control how people talk about it. That's the whole domestic terrorism piece. But the Department of Homeland Security should have nothing to do with the UFO file. And so the Central Intelligence Threat Initiative that we've been watching so carefully in this program in relation to UFOs and the sudden supposed openness by the government in discussing them is part of the CIA plan. Now, there's two pieces on that. Of course, when they tried to roll out, and they're still trying to get this going, this disinformation governance board. This is basically a ministry of truth, and we had the whole disaster with them having to stop it and Nina resigning and all the rest. Well, they're trying to come back now with Michael Chertoff. Remember him? He was the director of Homeland Security, and he was the guy who, in his family, had those machines, that you'd go through the airport with, and they would do all that X-ray action. Everyone's like, the radiation is bad. And it was well proven.
Yeah, the TSA naked machines.
Exactly,
right?
The TSA. And so there he was as the director of Homeland Security. And he was directly connected to this company making those. And somehow that company got chosen over this safer radio process. So Chertoff is now next up on that one. And this guy is a complete disaster. But the director of Homeland Security, Mayorkas, he came forward, of course, and he was pushing back on concerns about the DHS disinformation board, because his whole thing was, no, it's good to ban speech. That's what we like. Yeah. And so I did a report, and I want to call everyone's attention to it before we dive in tonight, all about the move of DHS into the UFO file, because I was seeing it and I was like, why are they staging these hearings with all these Department of Homeland Security people under counterterrorism? Something's wrong. And indeed there was. Mike Gallagher, who's a big CIA person, and the Wisconsin congressman who started talking about time travel and all this kind of stuff with UFOs, he was also a big tip-off on this. Watch Gallagher. And
do you want to go over what he said about time travel?
Well, he was saying that UFOs could be humans from the future and this whole thing. But a congressman introducing those types of talking points, there's a reason for it. He also brought up the completely fraudulent Wilson docs. This guy also is a graduate from the National Intelligence University, which was taken over by the Director of National Intelligence Office, the ODNI, and that's a weird move too. So something's going on inside. That's why you have Avril Haines and Gallagher and people like that making all these wild claims about UFOs and aliens attacking our ships and all this kind of stuff, which is not happening. And also, these are people who are considering ATIP as a real program. As we know from the documents that came out now, ATIP is not a program. That's why they're changing now the whole Lou Elizondo piece. When he comes out, they're now calling him the UAP Pentagon Coordinator. Before he was the leader of ATIP, but if there's no program, he can't be the leader of it. And ATIP was Advanced Aerial Threat Identification Program. That's what Lou said he ran, and turns out there was no such program. So nickname inside for an actual program called OSAP. And that program dealt with like Skinwalker Ranch and werewolves, and just had 3% of UFO stuff. So Lou made that up to pretend he was a UFO whistleblower and come out so he could get, the book deals and all this kind of stuff and run this CIA disinformation op through the UFO community, which was very successful, except that people, especially this show, keep deflating the balloon by revealing the real facts. So he got into some real problems with the New York Post articles, and now his title as, director of ATIP is ridiculous. So then he came out in a statement when he was writing to the government, and he said, all right, well, ATIP wasn't really a program, it was an activity. All right, well, throwing darts is an activity. Playing baseball is an activity. What are you talking about? If it's a program or it's not, so it's not a program. So, and the P in ATIP is program. So without that, it's, what is it? ITIA? So activity, yeah. Lou and his grill and some buddies and some CIA people trying to create a UFO threat. That's the ATIP fantasy. Didn't ever exist. There's no such program anywhere in any government records anywhere. So that was all a farce, as we pointed out in this program. But where is it going? So now they need the Homeland Security piece. Now, that's very interesting because we've also kind of brought up on this program a couple of times this site called the Debrief. And Debrief is weird for a lot of reasons. One of them is that the day that they were created, CNN cited them. So there was something wrong with that. And they had the whole kind of beach ball attacking U.S. warships and all that dumb stuff that got washed out. And they supported the whole Corbell circus and all that kind of stuff. So recently, the guy who runs that, Macmillan, got on there and was trying to go after the New York Post writer who had exposed this thing about ATIP, Stephen Greenstreet, and he was saying, the document you cited is a security document, are you violating, security and all this kind of stuff to get him off Lou's back. So we know where these people are coming from. Here's the story that they broke today, which is being picked up now in the corporate media. Incursions at the border. Homeland Security agents tell of encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena. So instead of having a group of people who've seen UFOs or people who've had encounters as the kind of authority on this, now it's Homeland Security agents. So it's Homeland Security is going to protect you from those bad old aliens, and then more bad footage of weird lights in the sky, like nothing to write home about. This is important because as we've pointed out in this show, the CIA threat part is crucial, and then when they move that over into the Department of Homeland Security is 250,000 employees. Those people are all jacked up. And doing surveillance on the American public. The whole thing is becoming just an incredible exercise in unconstitutionality, as it was when Bush set it up after the September 11th attacks. Well, they're moving the UFO thing into the September 11th attacks emergency category. That's the important piece and takeaway. So we're going to be doing more on that, but it's crucial when we get into these periods for us to be looking for some of the things that they're pulling there when nobody seems to be looking. But of course, we are indeed. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. You're here for X Series 127, and this is the fascinating Noah's Ark Atlantean DNA Amilius Mystery School Secret. These things all come together, and you're also going to see, as we talk about UFO disclosure just there's also going to be an effort behind disclosing a kind of a false disclosure around the Atlantis thing. This is something we've talked with Gigi Young about. And this particular episode is going to take us all to a different place. I often say in relation to Gigi's episode, they should come with a warning that says, may launch you into different type of psychic states. This episode is going to launch you into a very different place and go deep on the mystery side. But there's a couple of stories there that we've been keeping an eye on. And before we jump into anything, I want to mention that we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. So have those ready for Miss Olivia, and she'll even take them now and have them ready for us in the second part. How you doing over there?
Doing great. Fuber Fighter wanted to know, is the term homeland actually defined in any law or charter?
This is what they were able to do through Northcom. They called Northcom the defenders of the homeland. So based on that, they're trying to pivot on that. Before 2001, we were just run normally by the police as a society. In fact, the September 11th attacks and the emergency acts that followed put us under the dominion of Northcom. So the continuity of government part, which is the activity to suspend the Constitution in the event of an emergency, COG, all of Northcom takes over America. And so the combatant commander of Northcom, General Van Herk, would be the leader of the United States. And the idea is he'd have martial law and have regional governors, and then, as soon as things are over, we can have elections again. But unfortunately, you never get to that place. Just ask Haiti, who, after the assassination of their president, has this guy that they stuck in there, and they don't have any ability to run elections because it's all chaos and gangs over there. So when we think about continuity of government, Homeland is largely made up. Let's think about that. I mean, Homeland Security, you mean the security of the United States of America? The United States of America has a constitution. Homeland Security, a homeland can be anything you want. It's the homeland. They can ascribe any type of rules or laws to that. And so what we want is the United States of America. That's what our Constitution is. That's what everyone in every level of government pledges to. That's what the president pledges to defend. And so it's the United States. The homeland, forget it. It's nothing to do with anything. But yeah, they'll try to create it. They'll try to twist it that way. I want to remind also everyone to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but with all the incredible, and I mean remarkable, censorship that we're seeing in relation to getting these reports out, and just across the board for anything important, as we've noticed, especially over the past 2 years, but certainly as part of a long-term pattern. It's better for us to have that direct relationship through the newsletter, which is what we get into. And basically, you'll get the newsletter once a week and just let you know what incredible interviews we have coming up for you, incredible X-Series episodes, and some very interesting and important events coming up this summer that you won't want to miss. So make sure you sign up for that and be counted as far as that goes. I did the Sean Atwood podcast on Wednesday. That was pretty funny. Actually, Atwood was on the road, and so I did my kind of JFK Secret Space Program segment with Andrew Gold, and so that was fun. And so we had some viewers from that jump on over, and so we got a great response on that. It was very nice.
And I understand that our audience, certain members of our audience, made that happen by requesting.
True. Yeah, we have so many great people in the UK too. I want to say thank you. Great fans that we have there. And very often it's like, I guess, 5 hours ahead. So what would that be? Maybe it's like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning over there, and you're with us. So thank you. We really appreciate that. And to all our European fans as well. It's great here to be with you in the Ideas Room. The world is represented one way or another. And I saw Gigi Young out there earlier. We have a great crew out there, Miss Olivia running the Ideas Room. So we'll take those questions in the second part. Okay, you came here for Noah's Ark Atlantis Mystery School Secrets, and you're going to get them. You're going to get them tonight. And this is something that we're going to do together. It's a very, very interesting place that we're in with this information because it's starting to line up so much with the reality that we're in. But as you know, in this program, we spend a lot of time with the work of the Fourth Way School. And although we're going to rely mostly on Edgar Cayce's work tonight in relation to Atlantis and Amilius and the Belial group, especially the information regarding the hot zone, and but the Gurdjieff work is very important in relation to the allegories. They understand why these things were left for us. And so I wanted to get some of that on record tonight. Of course, that's P.D. Ouspensky and G.I. Gurdjieff. These are some segments of things that Ouspensky put down and also some that he discussed with Gurdjieff. And remember, this was all right during the Russian Revolution. So they were in chaos as well and looking around this whole idea of we need to preserve some aspect of humanity against this madness. And in fact, they did. Okay. This is Ouspensky talking about this period of time when they're putting together the Fourth Way School. Many new people made their appearance in our groups at this time, and although it was clear that everything must come to some unknown end, Gurdjieff's system gave us a certain feeling of confidence and security. We often spoke at this time of how we should feel in the midst of all the chaos, as if we had not got the system, or how we should feel in the midst of all this chaos if we had not got the system, Gurdjieff's system, which was becoming more and more our own. Now we could not imagine how we could live without it and find our way through the labyrinth of all existing contradictions. This period marks the beginning of talks about Noah's Ark. I had always considered the myth of Noah's Ark to be an esoteric allegory. Many of our company had now begun to see that this myth was not merely an allegory of the general idea of esotericism, but was at the same time a plan of any esoteric work, our own included. The system itself was an ark in which we could hope to save ourselves at the time of the flood. So just as the Gurdjieff system is opening up during the Russian Revolution, Theosophy had opened up all these ideas in 1875 and became an ark against this incredible push for scientific materialism, which was coming out of Germany and dominated everything through Darwinism and all the rest. That whole sequence of events, which set up the scientific materialism and the supreme dominance of if it can't be measured, it doesn't exist, led the mystery schools into their own battle, and ultimately with the idea that some of them were like, we have to let this information out, and we can't, we won't recognize humanity in 100 years if we let this go. So little by little, through kind of strange starts and people's strange personalities and movements and all the rest, through Theosophy, through Anthroposophy, the Steiner work, who also comments extensively on Noah's Ark, and then the Cayce work, which brings so much of Atlantis to the front, we started to get some kind of foundation of how we can do that. Now we face into the 21st century. We've been set up with a number of different things through these groups, and it's incumbent upon us to take that information to kind of start a new wave of understanding the mysteries as a guide through a very chaotic period. So that, as you can kind of see, as a foundation, as a background for what we're talking about here. Let's go further. This is Ouspensky again. I'm going to spend a little time on it because Ouspensky had a great grasp of what the religious traditions were telling us. The first myth is the story of the Great Flood and of Noah's Ark. The second, the story of the Tower of Babel and its destruction, the confusion of tongues. And the third is the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, of Abraham's vision and 10 righteous men for whose sake God agreed to spare Sodom and Gomorrah. The Great Flood is an allegory of the fall of civilization, of the destruction of culture. Such a fall must be accompanied by the annihilation of a greater part of the human race as a consequence of geological upheavals, of wars, of the migration of human masses, epidemics, revolutions, and similar causes. Sound familiar? Very often all these causes coincide. The idea of the allegory is that at the moment of the apparent destruction of everything, that which is really valuable is saved according to a plan previously prepared and thought out. A small group of men escape from the general law and saves all the most important ideas and attainments of the given culture. The legend of Noah's Ark is a myth referring to esotericism. The building of the ark is the school, the preparation of men for initiation, for transition to a new life, for new birth. Noah's Ark, which is saved from the flood, is the inner circle of humanity. The second meaning of the allegory refers to individual man. The flood is death, unavoidable, but man can build within himself an ark and assemble in it specimens of everything that is valuable in him. In such a case, these specimens will not perish. They will survive death and be born again, just as mankind can be saved only through its connection with the inner circle. So an individual man can attain personal salvation only by means of a link with the inner circle in himself. That is, by connecting himself with the higher forms of consciousness. And this cannot be done without outside help. That is, without the help of the inner circle. I'm going to stay right there with Noah's Ark and not get into the Tower of Babel, although the link there is very, very similar. And what Ouspensky has us doing is saying, look, Noah's Ark, even if it happened as a real incident, is actually allegorical about what the schools do for preserving humanity and preserving the incredible spiritual ideas, civilization, culture, knowledge, and the kind of higher wisdom through these periods when humanity reaches a low point and destruction follows. So we have that, and we've seen that play out through the mystery schools, of course, on a number of different occasions, everywhere from the Atlantean disaster to the Egyptian period, the Book of the Dead, Pythagoras, the Roman era, and so on. So much of that work goes underground. And it's funny because when they asked Gurdjieff about this at a certain point, they said, why have all these things been kept? If these groups have all this super knowledge, why is it kept from humanity? And Gurdjieff said, well, there's two aspects of the knowledge. There's what to do and how to do it. And the what to do, is in all the religious texts and all the rest, love thy neighbor, turn the other cheek, these types of things. But the how to do it, that is the methods to achieve that kind of emotional control, mind over matter and things like that, that stays hidden because when it's in public, it's persecuted because it's perceived as a threat by the powers that be. This pattern happens over and over again. So the how to do it is maintained within the mystery school structure. This is where we're heading with this, which is they have left now publicly a record for us over the course since 1875 in public. So really, you're talking about a 150-year period. And in fact, the end of the first piece of that, I would say, is the end of the Steiner part, so 1925. So Steiner had said, here's in 100 years, there's going to be another opportunity for the mystery schools and anthroposophy to do this. And we're in that window here in 2022. And so many of these things are coming together. And you hear on one side, oh, hey, we're seeing Atlantis and pieces of Atlantis being floated out there in the public. And then the UFO file, another great, understanding for humanity. But in the middle of it, humanity is losing that connection, that spiritual connection, and it's getting confused versions of these things. And ultimately, in the Atlantis story, for them to take what is actually there as a great lesson for humanity and use it as a false end run for an origin story that makes the transhumanists king is something that we very much have to watch out for as we're going forward here. That's what some of the work that Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, this is what they were gambling on. Small groups of people working together. As we talk here in the ideas room, this exchange is a kind of arc in itself, really. And probably that's why we see so much interference in work of this caliber. They'd much prefer for you to be big on the Johnny Depp. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 127. We're going deep here into Noah's Ark and the Amilius Atlantis DNA secret. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2, the second part here later tonight. And there's a lot of great faces in the ideas room. You can ask those questions now. Miss Olivia is putting them together. And before I launch into Noah's Ark, what do you got?
Okay, Karen Carpenter asks the question, was Noah preserving the genetic samples rather than actual mating pairs of animals?
Well, it's pretty interesting. The way the story is set out itself, it describes in very great detail what that immense structure looks like. And it is huge, the Ark. Now, an earlier tablet around this came up because the Noah story comes out of the Sumerian culture, in fact. It gets incorporated into the Bible, and it is thought that during Babylonian captivity, it was adopted, that they found there's an older story relating to this flood, and it was adopted into Judaism. But regardless, that story of the flood shows up. If you go to the Maya, that story is there as well. In Cayce's story, the Mayan version, that Atlantean version that founds the Mayan culture, that Noah is called Iltar, and we're going to get into him and what he was doing. He was an initiate in Atlantis. And I find this interesting because, Cayce said when Adam came to Earth, when that whole thing happened, it was 5 at once. There were 5 Adams. And I think when we get to Noah, we're also looking at 5 Noahs, because you have the kind of Sumerian Judaism Bible version of Noah, and then the Sumerian version being the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we'll get into tonight. All of these are fascinating pieces. But then on the other side of the world, you have the exact same stories, only through different figures. And again, I found one which was an Aztec ritual, and it's the same exact story. Again, a great leader coming through the flood, people surviving on a ship. And, you know, this thing goes round and round. The idea that, oh, these cultures had nothing to do with each other and it was all different just isn't true. I'm going to read some from the Aztec Noah legend. When the Sun Age came, there passed 400 years, then came 200 years, then 76. Then all mankind was lost and drowned and turned to fishes. The water and the sky drew near each other. In a single day, all was lost. And 4 flower consumed all there was of our flesh. The very mountains were swallowed up in the flood, and the waters remained lying tranquil during 52 springs. But before the flood began, Titlacahuan had warned that the man Nota and his wife, Nina, Nota and Nita, instead of Noah and his wife. And he said, make no more pulque, but hollow a great cypress, into which you shall enter the month Tezotl. The waters shall near the sky. They entered. And when they had been shut in, he said to the man, thou shalt eat but a single ear of maize, and thy wife one also. And when they had eaten 1 ear of maize, they prepared to go forth, for the water was tranquil. So here we have again God, warning this one group, saying you're going to go into this hollow out a cypress tree, which is an ark, and you're going to survive this, but it's going to happen. So culture being saved. Kukulkan saves culture as well when he shows up. And this is the confusion that happens so often in the Mayan religions. When we look back at it, it's confusing because Quetzalcoatl, who is Kukulkan, is portrayed 2 different ways. Kukulkan is a feathered serpent that's all over these different monuments, but Quetzalcoatl is a white man with a white beard. And, the Mayans and the Aztecs weren't white and they didn't have white beards. So who is this guy? He shows up on their shores and gives them all this wisdom. So this is definitely Atlantean refugee, and we're getting into that story. When we get to the Iltar story, which Cayce gives us, some of those very important documents in the Popol Vuh tell us about this flood. Here we have the hero in the story going away, and there's people here fading beneath the waves. And what's back there? It's a huge volcano blowing off. Well, what is it that Cayce said? The 2-eyed stone had set off all these volcanic activities in the earth, and that it had consumed the world in what sounds like a gigantic EMP, in fact. So Atlantis goes down dramatically, and there are all these legends, these little pieces of it afterwards. Iltar's story from the Cayce readings is particularly important. So I want to get into that and balance it against the traditional Sumerian and biblical story of Noah. But just a couple of key things, of course, from Noah. He gets this important message that he's chosen because of his righteousness to survive, and he has to build this ark. And even though he's going to look like a fool, he needs to do it. And he does take a good deal of harassment for doing it, if the Bible's any indication. Then by the time we get to the end of this period, when they keep sending out this dove looking for dry land and it finally comes back, then they know, and that's when the rainbow appears. So this is another very powerful symbol, and this is a covenant with humanity. And, God says, oh, I'll never destroy humanity again, and this is the rainbow's my covenant. This is very important because in the Old Testament story, it's pretty harsh, but, it's God that basically looks at the world and says, this is an experiment gone wrong. I'm getting rid of all this stuff, and brings in the rains through our own kind of evil. And it's very interesting because, when we look at it, there are a lot of esoteric traditions that talk about nature's great experiment. And when it gets to a certain point, there just needs to be a correction. So it's either that culture turns to the creative forces, they turn to their spiritual heritage, or they get destroyed. And we have a lot of examples of destruction. And so the Atlantis story, and it's not a myth, so I'll never refer to it as the Atlantis myth, the Atlantis story is crucial. It is our history, and it's there to kind of give us that indication. And the Noah part, according to Cayce, is an echo of the Atlantean destruction. So the Great Flood he ties directly to Atlantis. And of course, as somebody mentioned, all the animals 2 by 2 into the Ark, and he's going to make them all survive. So the practicality of gathering those animals as animals, probably you can't imagine, unless we're talking about just super hyper technology, caring for all those animals over that period of time and preserving them seems hard. So the idea that they would preserve the seeds of those animals and their DNA essence makes a heck of a lot more sense. It's interesting when we go back into these stories, because we're getting a lot that's coming out now, which we may get our answers on, because there's a lot of things coming out about them finding the location of Noah's Ark, which may open up a lot of doors. Now, I remember there's a report that was declassified in 1977 about the CIA spending $4 million in the search for Noah's Ark in Turkey, because there were these rumors that there was a wood structure very high up in Mount Ararat, and they had pictures of it. There were documentaries and things of that nature, and the CIA was all over this.
What do you mean the CIA was all over it?
They were investigating it. And what's fascinating too is when you get around the CIA in relation to archaeology and what I call the archaeology wars, you find in some of those declassified documents that they staked out the ARE, the Cayce Foundation, looking for information on the Hall of Records. In 1964, they infiltrated the Cayce Foundation with their own people. So we have to look at the CIA much differently than just as an agency. They represent an elite group that's looking for power, and they were set up dramatically through a law firm in 1947, and the law firm representing international finance. So we have to think of them differently than they are often supposed. Foreign relations. There wasn't even a lot of war experience going on with the people who set up the CIA. In fact, most of them were Wall Street lawyers. So it is for the preservation and building of business interests and that very high clique of financial power in the United States and around the world. That seems to be where their strings are pulled. Those people have always known that there are very important roles that special types of items play and special types of objects. That's why when you get Andrew Carnegie and all the things that he was seeking of Egyptian artifacts, and when we look at these different groups, the Rockefellers controlling the research around so many things from giants to Egyptian ruins in the Grand Canyon, this is all part of a large-scale pattern. And the way that I've studied it and that we've brought it forward on the X series is that this push is there. And this is something that they've done in the background. And it seems like there's two groups, just like when we get into the UFO file, there's X-Protect and X-Share. And the X-Protect group will preserve the secrecy even to the point of lethal means. And the X-Share group wants to move the culture forward and get it out and doesn't care. It's not worried about the implications of the society being shaken up or the power structure being tumbled down or using alternative energy. They like that idea. They want the culture to move forward. But also, when you get to archaeology and the mystery techniques, you're getting the same thing. These people, in fact, are seeking something out. And this brings me around on the Noah's Ark side to some very unusual stories. I'm going to get into this now. I'll jump into this piece, which is all about Bloomfield Moore, who we've brought up more than once in this program. And Clarence Bloomfield Moore and his strange expeditions into the hot zone in Florida and the remarkable things he found relating to the Two-Eyes Stone and the Atlantean culture. But who he is, who his mother was, and who that whole family spins off of, gives us an idea of the search for Atlantis and why the search for all of that different type of artifact and the advanced technology from an ancient period is so important to these people. And it operates. You can actually track it and you can see their footprints, but it's not something you're going to find in a regular history book. You have to use things like steganography in order to do it. And guess what? That's exactly what we use, right? So before we get into the Cayce piece on this, I want to jump into Bloomfield. How are you doing over there?
Great. There's tons of porn bots tonight that I have to.
What is that all about? Well, sabotage, right? Is that it? We've been seeing a lot of strange activity online. It's true. What else?
Najat Madri says, what are the chances the Ark was really some kind of spaceship or some kind of flying contraption? And Maury says, LOL, heard the CIA finally found a disc as in UFO, but not an Ark on Mount Ararat. Probably rumor, but still truth can be stranger than fiction.
Oh, the CIA has found UFOs before. That's for sure. We think that they were created actually because of the Roswell incident. So, yeah, that's actually a very good point. There are stories of the Atlantean flying machines surviving the fall of Atlantis. So this idea that somehow Noah's Ark was something that was flying could very well be. What's fascinating about it is in the Bible, in the Ezekiel story, we have that wheel within a wheel and the incredible, kind of spaceship thing that talks to him in the desert. Well, when they asked Cayce in trance about this Atlantean period, and they were like, what are these flying machines that the Atlanteans are using? How would you describe them? And Cayce is very matter of fact about it. He's like, oh, they're just like what Ezekiel describes, but at a much later date. So somebody still had these things and still had the ability to operate them. This gets us into two sides of culture, one who has advanced technology while the other one is operating on a different level. This is that split. And even if you look at Walter Bosley's work, when he talks about the NIMSA airship groups having that technology in the 1800s that eventually came out through the Wright brothers and others, the next century, this is how this works. The group that has this stuff, just like our traditional story of Columbus discovering America. And if you go into Dr. Farrell's work, Thrice Great Hermetica, you'll go in there and see all this stuff about Columbus knew too many things about America to be just going in there, willy-nilly. He already had a setup of where everything was. And so the idea is that the Templars actually discovered America some 200 years previously and were doing gold operations out of America, and also setting it up with sacred ceremony. So, in fact, the name America comes directly out of a Templar legend. So we have something there that I think we need to pay attention to, which is a little bit different than how we're supposed to think about something. And there are little windows in that the Cayce talking about the Ezekiel ship being something like the Atlantean ship, but much later, is pretty fascinating. And that's the kind of thing that the mystery schools would preserve. If you think about it, you have this incredible Atlantean period. They have incredible machines. They have the ability to make pyramids, and they have mind over matter. They have a number of things going by the Cayce kind of cosmology on the whole thing. Cayce's version of that Atlantean story is they are just as technologically compatible with us in the 21st century, but far advanced, in fact, beyond what we can do. So their main special power center was this 2-eye crystal, which is part of tonight's story and ties into the Noah story, believe it or not. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep tonight on Noah's Ark and the Atlantean story. Amilius, DNA, and the lost history the mystery school preserved for us here in the 21st century when it would be so powerful. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of this program. Right now, I'm going to dive in to an aside about Clarence Bloomfield Moore that explodes into the hot zone. It's great to have so many of you here with us. Anything else, Miss Olivia?
Tina Borich, didn't the Watchers help Noah build the Ark?
Well, the Watchers come in very heavily in the Enoch story, which got banned from the Bible, except for a few mentions here and there. the Book of Enoch is very powerful because they take him up. These watchers take him up in a ship. And when he's looking down at the earth, he's like, oh, the earth looks like porridge. When you look down from a good plane ride, it kind of, things look like porridge. So he meets, in his travels, Enoch meets these skilled artisans and the philosophers and the architects and mechanics and all these incredible people. So I think at a certain point in the Bible, the way that they were laying this out, the groups that were controlling that information were thinking, there's a few books that have been edited out of the Bible, and that's one of them. Because, Enoch and Melchizedek are really big secrets around the mystery traditions. And somehow the people who were controlling the early version of the Torah didn't think that was going to sort of mold with the whole thing. But what's interesting is the Enoch story for sure has the Watchers in there. Noah's getting instructions, very precise instructions. Build this 300 cubit feet. It reminds me of the instructions that happened later with Moses and the Ark of the Covenant, and the stories around the Ark of the Covenant and the remarkable things that it could do, including paralyzing armies. So this is pretty advanced technology for people hanging out in the desert. Something is going on there, which is a spiritual technological interface, and that goes back to what Cayce calls the mighty, terrible crystal, which is how it was remembered. Because it's mighty, it did all these incredible things for them, but then everything got destroyed through it. So that's what the story of the Two-Eye Stone is all about, and you will find references to the terrible, mighty crystal in the Bible, oddly enough. Okay, let's get a couple of these. Archaeologists claim to have found true location of Noah's Ark. These are interesting. They pop up once in a while. Of course, I mentioned the discovery in Ararat. There have been a few others. I'm going to go into a discovery in Yucatan, which may be getting us closer to this Hall of Records idea. But anyway, this one just came out at the end of last year. The discovery was made using advanced 3D scans of an area in eastern Turkey. Carmen Bolter, God bless her, before she passed away, told me that archaeology was going to change dramatically, and that even she was utilizing these 3D scans from the skies that you could get through these drones that can X-ray and basically tell you what's underneath any structure. So they're getting input and data now, which is far beyond anything that they've ever let out with that technology. So we're going into a different era around this. And what's funny is the things that they're discovering, from Göbekli Tepe to other things, are really backing up the Cayce Steiner theosophy story about advanced ancient cultures. Believed to be the location of Mount Ararat, the mythical resting place of Noah's Ark, as described in the book of Genesis. Such angles below the surface is something you would not expect to see in a natural geologic formation. These are some of the kind of scans that they have of them. They do look very unusual and promising. I'm trying to get an update on this story. And here again, archaeologists claim to have found true location of Noah's Ark. The discovery was made using the 3D scans of the area. Has the true location of Noah's Ark finally been ascertained? Archaeologists claim to have found a giant shape in the Turkish mountains that matches the shape and dimensions of the iconic biblical craft. But geologists insist that this mountainous formation is simply that, a rock. Noah's Ark is the vessel in the Genesis flood narrative through which God spares Noah, his family, and examples of all the world's animals from the world engulfing flood, except for the unicorn, right? The story is repeated in various forms in dozens of ancient cultures depicting massive floods, but for the most part, geologists and historians find the Genesis flood myth irreconcilable with modern understanding of fossil records of the planet's age. That's because they're using the wrong function of the age, and they're not using the actual Atlantean timetable. When you scratch that, yeah, you get problems. Now archaeologists with the Noah's Ark Scans project said that using advanced 3D scans, they have located a giant shape in the Turkish mountains, the proportions of which match the biblical descriptions of Noah's Ark. So we have the development of the finding of the Ark, which would be an incredible validation for that story beyond allegory. In the Cayce work, the Noah's Ark story is a real, actual story that happened to a real, actual Noah. But as I said, it seems like there's more than one. And just like there are 5 Adams in the Cayce story of the first man, I think we're looking at 5 different Noahs all over the world. And that 5 comes up a few times. Let's do a little more of this archaeology for a moment. Lost Mayan City discovered in the Yucatan. This is yesterday. Archaeologists from the Institute of Anthropology and History, INAH, have announced the discovery of a Mayan city using during construction works of an industrial parks named Merida, near Merida in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. I actually have a map of where this is. Yucatan and the Yucatan Peninsula is part of the hot zone, of course. And where they're looking is right around here, right around the top. And of course, this comes into play in all of our Polina Zalitsky work around the hot zone and the ancient ruins in that entire area that are underwater between Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula. Over here, Piedras Negras, a number of researchers have identified Cayce's Hall of Records, because remember he said there were 3, and a number of them think, that's where he was pointing to in the Yucatan. And there are reasons for that, which we'll go into. And this becomes important because these things are going to roll out now. They have the technology to find them. The question is, how much of the truth are we going to get in relation to them? And that becomes very important. Our knowledge base of what the mystery schools gave us as a fundamental understanding of what should be found is going to guide us so that we don't get thrown over by some of those processes. Some discoveries get ahead of the machine, like Polina Zalitsky's discovery of a Cuban city off the western tip of Cuba. And when that happens, it's quite fascinating because the machine has to cope with it. So it starts covering it. And then later, through a little bit at a time, tries to throw shade on it. And then they just get out of there. They just don't pay attention to it at all. If the story gets out without their help, they'll have to do something in order to, co-opt the story. And that's what we want to watch for. Nowadays, their methods have changed. They used to be very big on, let's keep it mum, don't tell them about those UFOs in there. And so that whole secrecy mafia was really the front line. Now what they're doing is they're like, well, people are really fascinated with these things. Tell you what, we'll use their own fascinations against them. If in 2018 the top search on Google was UFOs, why don't we use that and all their interest on it against them? And that way, we can create UFO fantasy, we can create UFO threat, we can do all this stuff, and they'll believe it because they're already in that camp. And we've kept the real information from them for so long that they know that we're hiding something. So we'll give them this kind of false version, which makes us heroes for protecting them. That's where they're coming from. That's why the CIA disclosure, whether it's UFOs or ancient Atlantis, is totally bogus. And it's a parody of real disclosure. And this is what we need to get to. So when you have carnival barkers on the UFO side, like Corbell and Elizondo and people like that, it's very important that when that starts to surface on the Atlantean side, that we're aware of it and catch it better than the UFO community did. Because the UFO community was so desperate, they signed on with the CIA, most of them, and they were like, yeah, you're right. God bless you for bringing us disclosure, not realizing that they were, feeding everyone into the lion's mouth. The idea of going to the CIA for the truth is like going to Jeffrey Dahmer for comfort and understanding. So, when I look at that, we have to be real about it, but this is how we're going to get into it because we're seeing these discoveries. They are happening, and we are in that period. And we were told by the schools that these things were going to happen. They left that record. However, people want to look at, if somebody is inclined to look at the work of Steiner or Cayce and be like, I don't know what to think about it. Here's a crucial takeaway of the whole thing. They wanted us to know something about the era that we're in. They were messengers. They were early messengers. They were kind of like the John the Baptist, voice in the wilderness thing. And at the time, it seemed like, they're marginal, they're crazy. Cayce's talking about flying machines and things that can go through mountains and all this stuff. And then little by little, if you look back at that period, so many of the things that he talked about are becoming just commonplace. So with the discovery of Atlantis. Let's talk about some of these archaeology wars, though, and how these groups search for the knowledge about things like Noah's Ark or ancient Atlantis or the Two-Eye Stone, and keep those in certain types of corridors. They keep it in certain types of ways with small groups who are pursuing these things. So if you learn how to spot the way that they do their research and who those groups are, then you're home free because those connections are in public. But if you can't find out in the beginning what the steganography is, you're in trouble. And it's like you go around in circles. Some of the names I've found out in relation to the search for Atlantis in a very public way, but operating with this behind-the-scenes activity that you can read through the historical documents of what they did. These names keep coming up. Ketchum, Ketchum. Jessup, Jessup. Bloomfield, Bloomfield. And Hemingway, or Hemingway. You'll find them over and over again when we get around these types of sources. Let's start with one, Clarence Bloomfield Moore. This is a very important expedition that someone did, Clarence did, to Mount Royal, Putnam County, Florida. And he found mounds and all types of ancient artifacts. And these artifacts relate directly to the Atlantean egress from Bimini into Florida. The objects that he found are so remarkable. And, we put them in the... actually, I have a cross-section of them here. Let's take a quick look at them. These are the objects themselves, and they reveal all sorts of different types of dynamics about the sun, exteganography here, really high-end technology, spiritually activated technology, and they're all part of his East Florida Expeditions book. I can tell you this book, which I have here, I want to show you something. This book weighs about 20 pounds, and it is dense. Very dense with information that seems on the surface to be, this is somebody's archaeological research. If you go even a half-inch deep on that book, you're going to find a lot of fascinating pieces. First thing you find out is that his mother was Clara Bloomfield Moore, who was a real heavy hitter in theosophy and was the funder of John Keeley. And anyone who watches this program is familiar with Keeley. We've done some shows on him. But Keeley is fascinating for a few reasons. One is that he had a very advanced technology that comes up in Steiner's work. There's a whole chapter in Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine about Keeley. He was using a kind of psychic ether as power. And he demonstrated, according to a variety of reports, a flying machine to the United States Army in the 1880s that could go 500 miles per hour. So the work that he was doing very parallel with Tesla's advances as well, 1890s, right in that window there. What happens is he dies suddenly, and she's been helping him all along. And she realizes what's going on is that the groups that are assembling on the corporate side to take over Keeley's technology and basically, use it to dominate humanity, they are muscling in. And so when he's dying there from this quite sudden illness, she and his partner ship off all that information to the Theosophical Society, all the things that they were working on. And the Theosophical Society figures out really quickly, because this is before World War I, that they'll use this technology. These groups will use this technology to annihilate humanity. So they push it back underground. And in both of Steiner's and Blavatsky's work, you can hear that echo. of them being very concerned about what's going to happen with this technology and how the public isn't ready for it, because what's happening is the groups that are controlling them would just use it to basically, it's like, I think Besant said something along the lines of humanity will use that to annihilate each other. So we get into kind of a strange thing there with his mother, and there's a lot of unusual pieces about her as well. Let me see if I can get a shot of her. Clara Jessup Moore. There's the name again. You following with me? Jessup. Of course, when you get to the 1950s and you get Morris Jessup, who's very, very deep on the UFO file, you find that his middle name is Ketchum. Again, with this Ketchum, Jessup, Bloomfield, Hemingway, it's there. He just keeps popping up over and over again. And we still, there's a steganography to it. We still don't know exactly who the root of those groups are, but we're finding out. So Clara Jessup Moore was a philanthropist and a philosopher. She was born in Massachusetts, actually. She married businessman Bloomfield Haynes Moore and resided in Philadelphia from the date of her marriage onward. Following the death of her husband, she moved to London, became part of Theosophy. She eventually died in 1899. She organized all of these expeditions, and it's her son, Clarence Bloomfield Moore, who becomes a really kind of impressive Florida and mounds in Mississippi, in Georgia, and all these different places, searching for these ancient relics related to Atlantis. What's fascinating is that on the other side of that, her granddaughter will marry a very interesting fellow who is the Swedish explorer, who's Eric Rosen. What's interesting about von Rosen is he's the guy who comes up with the swastika and reenacts the swastika, and that the Nazis eventually adopted from. And some of his early pieces on that's von Rosen's. And again, the X-steganography in the swastika. But before the swastika is used as a, as a hate symbol or as a elitist symbol or anything of these nature, it's coming out of a, actually what's interesting is Rosen found it as part of the runes. So we're getting a totally different read on what that symbol was supposed to be, and it gets adopted as part of the Finland Air Force, the same Finland that wants to join NATO now with the border, a long border with Russia. But what's fascinating about all that, I believe, is they only recently dropped that swastika symbol, and they regarded it. There was a whole group of aviators who regarded it as such a powerful luck symbol that if you look at Lucky Lindy's, Charles Lindbergh's incredible plane, when they took the engine apart, right in the middle of it was one of these swastikas. Finland's Air Force quietly drops swastika symbol, 1920. There it is. They changed it out from the swastika to this little bird flying. That's something that very recently happened. It took them a long time to get rid of that good luck symbol. But again, that's von Rosen, and he's directly connected to Bloomfield Moore. And Bloomfield Moore, of course, is also, it's her son that does these incredible expeditions looking for Atlantis. So we're getting the combination of these people tight and together as we go. What's interesting about Clara Jessup Moore is she had all these books on etiquette, and I found that very interesting. But she was the top funder of John Keeley, and she got Keeley's inventions to the level that they were at through her funding. And she's very steeped in the mystery school aspects, so she's a major player on that side. Okay. Now, let's take a look here at going into Steiner's piece around Noah's Ark, and to give us some idea of the Atlantean part. And then we're going to bring in the Atlantean Noah's Ark piece. That should give us enough time, I think, to take your questions in 20 minutes. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 127, and we're going deep. how is everyone seeing my image out there? Is it fuzzy? Is it clear? What are you getting? Because when I'm looking on this screen over here, I'm getting some fuzzy images going on. Any comments?
I'm waiting to see the response.
Oh, okay. No, it looks like it's gold. It looks like it's gold again. Okay. They must be just utilizing low energy on that.
Everybody says it's clear.
Excellent. Good. So I want it, because with those messages, when we're using so many graphics tonight, it's going to be crucial. The Atlantean piece. I'm going to go into this backwards, actually. All right, so you're very familiar on this show. We covered the hot zone. I didn't make this a hot zone episode, but the hot zone is in it. And you know, the general foundation of that is there's a whole thing involved in the Caribbean and the Bahamas relating to these ancient advanced ruins that are underwater. And this is something we brought forward in our research in 2018. And I got a lot of people who got on board with me and said, you know, I worked for such and such a company, and when I was scanning the ocean floor, I wasn't allowed to say anything. There was an NDA against me saying anything if I spotted ruins. This is what we know about the hot zone. Whatever you see down there, you're not supposed to mention. So if you're cruising around underneath the waters of the Bahamas and you see, you know, a temple of Isis, you can't share that with the public. And if you're in the military, you're under a court martial if you do. And if you're for a company, you'll never, you know, they can actually launch charges against you. So if we've got this going on, then we have to start to wonder what all the politics around the hot zone have been. And we've seen some politics around Cuba recently as well. So when we're looking at this, we're starting to get a handle on why that is there. Even the Cuban Missile Crisis, things before that, Batista, you know, all the traditional, the mafia and, you know, drugs and all that kind of stuff, and the typical Latin America murder incorporated. I understand those pieces, and they do play a role there, so the hot zone becomes confusing. However, the aspect about ancient ruins relating to ancient technology and the extent of those ruins is one of the big major geopolitical secrets for all those groups, and it's part of the reasons why there's so many of these battles going on. We've detailed the very heavy work that Ernest Hemingway was doing for someone in relation to those Atlantean ruins between Bimini and Cuba. Of course, there we have the Bimini site of the Bimini Wall, which Cayce predicted would rise in 1968, and bingo, it did. I've talked to Trig Adams, who discovered it, and we're still working with him to get him on the show. So this is where a lot of this story goes. We're in the hot zone, and we're talking about a landmass that fell in a grip of survivors. Again, you have that Noah's Ark motif. In this case, it's Iltar who takes his followers to the Yucatan. A couple more things to touch on, and I may have you may have seen these before if you watched the Hot Zone episodes, but this is a NASA engineer's graph of what Cayce described as the two-eye stone, the crystal that powered the Atlantean culture, as a six-sided figure that was made of a kind of blue crystal. And we have to kind of take that piece and say, you know, Cayce had a tremendous accuracy. What was he doing with these 900 readings on Atlantis giving us this information? We needed that doorway. We needed that understanding about this previous culture on which we were so heavily facing ourselves, and we were relying on this. In the Cayce work, it goes even deeper, and you can accept this or reject it, but that the same people were reincarnating now and facing themselves for this Atlantean debacle that they went through then, and it's come back around, and here we are again. And that society has faced this before. In any case, there's deep, deep indication of extreme ancient advanced technology, and that's a very big story. It has nothing to do with aliens at all, and probably is a much more guarded secret and a much deeper secret than the UFO files as well. Cayce himself, you know, the psychic gift could prove to be a real problem for him at times. And this is a guy who was a salesman and a Sunday school teacher and a photographer. And his deep psychic ability, people came to him for psychic diagnosis very often once they learned that he had actually healed his own voice through his readings. And what he would do, he would go into a trance state and be able to obtain any information as long as he was prompted to by a guide. So somebody could come to him with a problem and say, I have such and such an ailment. And they could be in any part of the world and send that to him. And he could sit and he could bilocate to them and observe them energetically and give them a diagnosis. This happened over and over again. And there are so many affidavits and things. There's such an incredible track record for Cayce. Unfortunately, in around New Age circles and things like that, we've had a lot of people writing off Cayce and being, Cayce reincarnated, and there's been a lot of frauds out there related to Cayce. But Cayce's work itself is incredible, powerful legacy for us relating to spirituality, holistic health, ancient history. I mean, there's so many mystery school realms to the work that he brought forward. And he did it himself with, his family. So I want to point that out, too, that he was an average person. I mean, here he worked his photo studio. This was not somebody who was seeking sensationalism. Over and over again, people would come to him, and it seemed almost like the hand of fate guiding him into this. And at a certain point, this guy who'd been a Sunday school teacher starts going into trance readings, and he is talking about Atlantis. And it's a challenge for him, too, because, in his traditional teaching, the world begins in 5000 BC in Samaria. And that's what the Bible would let you know, that version of history. And so he's giving a much deeper history, and he starts to become comfortable with it after a time. He faces a lot of difficulties. And there's a strange thing about when he has these photo studios, they seem to perish in fires over and over again. And there's a strange thing about Cayce and fire, including the fact that one time when he was upset and he lay down on a friend's couch, the couch went into flames. So there's some incredible energy that danced off Cayce and created these really remarkable energetic situations. Around 1910, a doctor picked up on the fact that all these people were getting healed by this magnetic psychic wonder named Edgar Cayce, and a story in the New York Times ran on him. That doctor's name was Ketchum. Here we go with the names again. Remember, Ketchum, Jessup, Bloomfield. Seems like we go in circles. Not to mention the fact that Hemingway was from Ketchum, Idaho, right? So what we have here is Cayce coming into being well known, and this has its ups and downs and things. And what he decides is that he's going to try to balance his life as a photographer against his psychic work, and that works sometimes. Sometimes he retreats from the psychic work completely, and then things will draw him back into it. For example, the fact that his wife Gertrude developed tuberculosis made him have to go back and learn how to help her in that state. And he went back and did the readings. And in fact, she got a lot better using a charred oak keg and some other holistic instructions that Cayce gave her. That meant a lot to him. And so he got to trust his own psychic gift, which over and over again had been abused and exploited by others. There's a famous story of his father, who was not always the most righteous person, of him and Ketchum, that very same doctor, using Cayce after they had done the readings to get the race results that were coming out so they could go down to the track and play the races and collect the money. And what would happen is Cayce wouldn't remember that those things were happening, but he was having extreme migraines. He was walking around and he didn't even know if he could give readings with those migraines. And out of nowhere, a robed figure, this man who looked very much like he just came out of India in a turban, comes up to him in his office, puts his hand on his hand and says, "You're with the wrong people." And he figured it out very quickly that there was something going on. And so his father and Ketchum convinced that this is what they were doing, and they stopped doing it. But then again, he got away from doing readings and he went to Alabama and opened another photo studio, and it went up in flames. So there's a lot of interesting things navigating around Cayce, which is that he is beset over and over again with challenges, but he brings through this remarkable incredible work, and he has a kind of Christian service element. And this is so important. I think when you look at the mystery school aspects, this is particularly true with Cayce, they have a dual nature, attunement on one side and service on the other. So you have the attunement to your higher self, the understanding of these higher mysteries, God and spirituality, and then you fulfill it in service. The attunement, very often we see emphasized in circles that deal with spirituality, but the service aspect isn't often. So you have a kind of an imbalance there. So this gets deeper and deeper, but I think in the Cayce story, it was always service first, and it shows how remarkable the work and that he left behind was. One of the things that, when they set him up with this association to do the readings, the guy who came in to help him set it up, he said, the first thing I want you to do is send all the money back. People were sending him checks after this book came out about him, There Is a River. And this shows you the real integrity of the person. He said, send them all the money back and ask them if they want to join the ARE, the Cayce Foundation. And then, they can pay me as part of joining it, but I'm not going to take their money just for the readings. So, there's something deep with Cayce. He knew where he was coming from, even when it was he was very destitute at times, according to stories of his family. So we have to understand that as a real dimension of why the quality of Edgar Cayce's work is so important and that is so valuable. And so when we get to the Atlantis side, there's nobody really with a track record like Edgar Cayce on it. Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I have, in all the years I've known about Cayce, it's never occurred to me to ask this. Did it ever occur to him to try hands-on healing?
There were people who said that he gave them hands-on healing.
Okay.
Yeah. He also, in readings, would train people how to do that. So it is an aspect of it. Yeah. He also could see auras as well, interestingly enough. And what's really weird is he had a description of seeing auras, and then he said at a certain point, if somebody would show up, he could see their actual past life personage in the auric field of them. So if they had been like a Civil War general or an American Indian or, a Native American or an ancient Egyptian, whatever it was, he would see the important life that they had in their aura. So that's quite a kaleidoscopic vision that he had going on there.
Can I ask you another question about Cayce?
Sure.
Matakwe Oyasin wants to know, DJ, is it true that Edgar Cayce pointed out where most of the offshore oil was in the Gulf of Mexico, i.e. hot zone?
He did. He did oil readings, and they did cover that. What's interesting is he talked about how there's so much gold beneath Bimini that it would outdo all the gold that's in circulation in the world today. This may be another aspect of why the hot zone is so crucial. But what does that gold have to do with the strange magnetic occurrence and all the anomalies and the kind of apotheum effects that we see going on down there in the hot zone? It's quite phenomenal, his grasp of geology and being able to see it, and then being able to see it across time. He would say, for example, that the Nile River used to flow through Africa and give out at the Atlantic Ocean. And, that's something that they proved many years later with satellite photography, but it's in the readings from 1926, 1927. So where is that kind of knowledge? It gives us some idea of what happens when we attune ourselves. What abilities are we missing? What are we being told also that we are? That gets us to a very deep question. And that's why I think the Atlantis story is so crucial that Cayce brings forward here. Okay, everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 127. It's the Noah's Ark Amilius DNA piece and how that relates to Atlantis. We're going to be getting into that crucial aspect and then taking your questions in about 15 minutes here. How you doing out there?
Doing great.
Excellent. Okay. Great full house tonight. I appreciate it. Because we're short on time, actually, let's jump here into the stories around the fact that the person who was Noah actually came to Cayce for a reading. Deal with that. That's a very weird thing if you study the Cayce readings, that there seems to be waves of people that are associated at certain times. In the late 30s, a number of people associated with the Noah story came to him for past life readings. and would show up as, this is Noah's daughter-in-law or whatever it happened to be. So this is actually quite remarkable when you get into it. So, so he's giving an overview on a 4-year-old child. And the 4-year-old child is very sensitive to weather conditions. That was the first kind of thing about him, which is a tip-off of where this is going. So let me get into some of this, because the individual themselves are remarkable. And if it is Noah reincarnated, wow. So he's saying, look, this kid, give him a lot of spiritual guidance. He's going to know a lot. So don't question him too much. He should be trained in spiritual truths. Most of these the entity will give expression to in the attempt to direct. Little may be told to the entity of the stories of Scripture that it cannot tell you. But there should not be a forcing of the issue. Rather, let there be a normal development. Do not question the entity as to the sources of his information. Do not correct the entity as to that given, but keep a detailed record of what he says. This is interesting because he's kind of almost like a prophet born to this family. Do not impress or give the impression that the entity is different from other individuals. Do have the development physically and spiritually as one. Remember, Cayce is seeing him now. He's 4 years old getting this reading. He's seeing his entire life. In giving this interpretation, then, these are the activities of the entity in the earth plane that we would give as a background, not appearances in great number. That's interesting, too. Thus, the entity is a dreamer and at times quite talkative, at other times very quiet. The entity does not know the meaning of a stranger, yet is one that analyzes every individual he meets. As to the appearances in the earth, then, these, as indicated, have been few. Before this, the entity was in the Scotch land. The entity began its activity as a prodigy, as one already versed in its associations with the unseen, extremely psychic. The elemental forces, the fairies, and those of every form that do not give expression in a material way are only seen by those who are attuned to the infinite. Then the entity in the developing was in the name Thomas Campbell, the reformer in the land of the present nativity, which, as combined later with Barton Stone, brought into activity that known as denomination. Of course, if you go into Thomas Campbell, you find quite a bit. The intent and purpose was to unify all Protestant thought, speaking where the book spoke, keeping silent where it kept silent upon the activities. Hence, the entity throughout its experience was not disposed to be other than a speaker. He was basically a preacher. The abilities as a speaker, as a minister, will be part of those faculties and characteristics and should be considered. Do not allow the entity in the first 10 to 12 years to get away from the spiritual truths in the Old and New Testament. For it will be easy for it to be a cult or an ism to be formed about the entity and its prognostications, but rather let it be one glorifying the truths that are promised in the 30th of Deuteronomy. And the 30th of Deuteronomy is that Moses section where it says, if you will be my people, I will be your God. So he's giving them the hints for what's going to prompt the right spiritual reaction. Before this, the entity was that one upon whom the mantle of Elijah fell, who in his material activity performed more unusual acts or miracles that are only comparable with the master himself. So he's saying that he was Elisha. The entity was then, as Elisha, brought into the experience much that was of unusual in expression. There's a fantastic story in the Bible of Elisha staying very close while Elijah is saying there's a chariot of fire that's going to take me from heaven and I'm going to ascend. And there's a group following him, but he's absolutely persistent and stays with him. And then Elijah, before he ascends into heaven in this chariot of fire, he turns to Elisha and he says, all right, whatever you want, just ask me and I'll give it to you. And he says, I want a double portion of your spirit on me. And, you know, Elijah said, that's a really tough thing that you're asking. You shouldn't have asked that, actually. But nonetheless, because I said I would do it, I'll give it to you. And he says, but you have to watch me as I ascend into the chariot of fire. And this whole thing takes place. And in fact, one of the earliest stories of someone being raised from the dead in the Bible is Elisha raising someone from the dead. So let's go back to the reading. In the present, in the experience of this entity, there may be expected just an unusual expression as those coming to the entity to receive the blessing from the handkerchief, the photograph, or even those things that the entity may touch or bless. So people already sense that he's going to be, a very special individual. But let these be natural sources, not as something unusual. These then are the manners. Let each day be an opportunity. Okay, so he's giving them basic parental instructions. But then he goes here to an interesting quote, and he indicates that this individual, in fact, is Noah. And he talks about this is a soul that would bring blessings to all. And then he says the responsibility rests with the mother and the father for the next 8 years that they'll be given here for these studies. For it will be easy to teach him Greek. It will be easy to teach him those things that were portions of the activity. For before that, the entity was that one to whom was entrusted man's advent into the world, Noah. So it's very interesting. If you follow this guy, there are some updates that are unusual where he lives a very Christian life and he opens a number of supermarkets there in the South. But they say that, in terms of like the Noah style thing or being mystical or anything like that, it doesn't seem to show up later in his life in this check reading. But here we have an incredible individual with all those abilities. But we also have Cayce telling us that this mystery school line of Noah and Elisha are the same person. And we've seen that also with what Cayce suggested with the different lives of Jesus, that, Jesus came through as these different figures, including Adam, that Jesus was originally Adam, reincarnated through 30 different lives. So this is something strikes to kind of the deeper part of the mysteries and what the mystery school souls are doing. They're showing up here and they're reincarnating at different times to help humanity. And they've already come in and done incredible things, and they keep signing up and returning to help move that whole evolution on Earth forward. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 127. We just heard Edgar Cayce's reading on Noah. It was a 4-year-old boy. And there are some notes there in the Cayce reading about how the mother said he always knew when a storm was coming. He had an incredible sense of the weather. And he seemed to have an unusual psychic ability. But when he got older and he did his own life, the thing that showed up, he was kind of a businessman who kept a Christian life, but there didn't seem to be anything too remarkable about him. And this also happens too, which is we can have these remarkable past lives, and if we don't fulfill things that are going on now, then we kind of miss the boat on some of the promises that are given to us on this. So this is a key part of it. But remember this also, reincarnation is pretty frowned upon in Christian circles. So for Cayce to be giving this kind of information and then identifying Noah, you can imagine the kind of hassle. And it's true that Cayce got thrown out of different churches he was a Sunday school teacher at because they didn't like his psychic stuff. So we have to also think in terms of Cayce, the type of life that he had becomes very important. He is kind of persecuted through these various experiences to get the message through. So the question is, what is that message that he's barreling through? Certainly one of them relates very strongly to Atlantis and Noah. And his version of the hot zone Noah, who goes to the Mayan land, is Iltar. And we're going to read his story next. But before that, Miss Olivia? Yeah.
Alpha Warrior. Supposedly, the flood was to clean the Nephilim from the realm. Did Cayce ever mention them?
Oh, sure. Well, he also talked about the mixtures, and this gets into the things, which we've touched on a few times. What happened is the Atlanteans get to a point, just like we're doing DNA mixtures. There's a high DNA aspect around the Amilius group, and the other group, the Belial group, is trying to figure out how they can just make people. They seem to just project people, and there's no birthing process, nothing. They just... And so they get very curious about this, and they start experimenting with different types of people, and that they do all sorts of different mixtures. So they're like an early DNA laboratory on the Belial side, and they mix a group up to a point where they become known as the Things. And what they are basically are very advanced cyborgs. So this is a very deep aspect. And when we look with retrocognitive eyes at the Cayce work, this is rather fascinating, because here he is describing these human machines who are doing this, but somehow there's an aspect of soul trapped in them. And the Atlanteans, the Belial group, are using them as slaves. And they're doing all the work in the fields and all the rest of it. And they call them things or untouchables, etc. And they're not considered spiritual in any way. They're just considered like we would consider a machine. So some of the things that we hear now about our own scientists trying to mix, like growing a human ear on a mouse and things like that, and all the different types of DNA experiments that they've done are a real echo to this Frankenstein aspect that existed in the Atlantean era. So part of the flood, the destruction of Atlantis, got rid of some of those mixtures. You still see the echo when Rata is in Egypt in 10,500 BC, and he sets up the Temple Beautiful to somehow change the endocrine systems of these things so they can have a full human evolution. And he does. He attempts it, and he makes it happen. But they are the offspring of basically these kind of test tube experiments that the Atlantean Belial scientists had done, and in some cases had crossed them with animal types as well. So there's a big story there in the Things, and it has not been explored because, when you get into the Cayce readings, you're dealing with the Association for Research and Enlightenment. They're really nice people. They really are. But they don't, they don't want to be edgy and, bring up the Cayce was talking about cyborgs, Atlantean cyborgs. They want to do hey, it's a holistic thing. He was a Sunday school teacher. He's got a New Age philosophy. They don't want to deal with the Atlantis part. And it's been an active program inside the ARE to suppress that stuff. That's why so much of it has stagnated. So as much as I like the organization, I think they haven't done a job with Cayce's work on Atlantis. In fact, his son, Edgar Evans Cayce, who I had the opportunity to meet, and who at 91 looked, like maybe in his late 50s or something. The guy was incredible. But he wrote a book in 68 called Edgar Cayce on Atlantis, which is really the breakthrough book on Atlantis. And we're going out now 50 years later, and the Cayce Foundation hasn't advanced all of those Cayce Atlantis readings much further than that. So in exposing that information and studying that information around Atlantis and the hot zone with Cayce readings, I was astounded that there was so much of it that is not even public. I mean, you can get it, but it's not out there in books. In fact, the Cayce readings that are out there in books measure to about maybe a quarter of the material that came through them. And I understand all that too. I mean, it's not easy to make the book aspect celebrated. So I think as an organization, they go with what works. They have certain conferences, the holistic health and things like that. I don't think they want to talk about the cyborg mixtures in pre-Atlantean times who are fighting each other with the Two-Eye Stone. I mean, it's a remarkable story that Cayce tells, and it is edgy. I'm going to tell you, very, very edgy. And I've always been impressed with Cayce and his work, and understood that it came from a much higher place as a result of that.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
It would seem to me that all of the beings that God created everywhere in the universe would get to through evolution, would get to a point where they would want to take over their own evolution and accelerate it through genetic manipulation. Is this a pattern that recurs and is...
Even Rata, it's interesting. Rata, who is a former incarnation of Cayce and is the Amilius Law of One priest, and he's a very important figure, but he also tries to make the perfect human And he gets involved in this whole scenario to try to, they set him up with someone to mate with who is perfect. And he gets convinced that this is something good to do. And then they try to take him down. It was actually a plot by the Egyptian priests to take him down. What's interesting is the Amilius aspect is so important because the Amilius group tries to bring forward the same kind of high-level spirituality in the Earth experience. And the process that it had developed for that, Rata comes out of the Amilius part of the experience. And so the two-eye stone and all those types of things that we hear about are all about connecting with what they describe as the saint realm. They're going and they're using the technology to connect with these higher forces. What happens on the back end, however, is the Belial group is using the knowledge of the Amilius group in order to dominate the physical plane. This is the same battle that we're seeing now with the cutoff of spirituality and the incredible emphasis on scientific materialism. So we're deep in this battle. We see it all the time. The harmonic phase that Steiner talks about that we've moved into, we're here, right? And we face it all the time. And I discuss with people very often, I'll tell you an interesting thing, actually, which is, this is kind of a funny story, but I got invited before she passed away, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice. She was speaking at Columbia Law School, and I got invited by a friend of mine to go there and watch the speech and meet her. And the next day, John Roberts was going to be there. So I went to go to this, and I was sitting there with my friend and all these lawyers who had just graduated from law school or were already part of a law firm. And I remember the conversation was obsessive about vacations that they could take and the things that they wanted. And I could relate to the good life and all the things that they were after. And I wasn't judging them for it, but I was also amazed that here there's this idealism about law. And here they are in the middle of Columbia Law School. They're seeing a Supreme Court justice. And, their fascination was about Turks and Caicos and wanting to, live the high life, the rich and famous, and talking about how they could get $700 an hour from a certain client. And this reminds me just of how much this type of thinking, because it is normal to want to expand the things you want to do, and you should have just as much money as you want. I have no problem with that. But there was an obsession, and I had expected, well, I'll meet these people and they'll talk to me about these incredible law cases or, how they got into being law. But the only thing that they wanted to talk about really were, vacations and drugs. This gave me a real kind of, I've seen this before in these types of situations. So there's a kind of a drug that goes with being in that position, and people start to believe in the drug. And we see very often that they burn out as a result of that. So that's what you made me think of with that. So I hope that kind of is somehow in context. All right, Iltar, are you ready?
Yes.
Iltar, I showed the Iltar. Let me see if I still have it. Oh, this is a different one. Actually, this is interesting also. That's a 12th century. There's a lot of steganography in this version of the Ark. That's a fresco on a very important church in France. And again, this idea of preserving the steganography, the information through Noah's Ark, again, very important. All right, so Cayce's here, and he's talking about Iltar, who is basically the hot zone Noah. And I'm just going to kind of give us a little hint of this, and then we'll jump into your questions in the second part. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here in X Series 127, going deep on Noah's Ark, Amilius, and the Atlantean connection and mystery. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. And Iltar, I think we can understand, the best way to understand him is to just think of him as the Noah of the hot zone. And he's somebody who gets the word Atlantis is going down, and he goes to recreate that entire civilization as a result. Okay. It's very interesting. The readings are given for a very important family in New York called Zentgraf, who are absolutely obsessed with Atlantis. And there's going to be a very big payoff to that. Not in this episode, but remember the name Zentgraf, Zentgraf. This is the reading they asked for. And they say, give us a historical treatise on the origin and development of the Mayan civilization, answering questions that we ask. And Cayce in trance responds, yes, in giving a record of the civilization in this particular portion of the world, it should be remembered that more than one has been said and will be found as research progresses. That which we would be of particular interest would be that which superseded the Aztec civilization that was so ruthlessly destroyed by Cortez. This is interesting. We know the terrible things that Cortez did, and there's all this stuff. Sometimes you hear historical defenses like, well, the Aztecs were terrible anyway. They were doing human sacrifice and all the rest of it. Well, here's the Cayce source looking at Cortez and thinking, oh my God, he horribly distorted and, just brought terror to this culture. This is the thing that we need to understand, which is the groups that seek for power alone will, when they confront these ancient civilizations and ancient truths, they're just, in the case of Cortez, they were just after gold and power and domination. We have that on Earth over and over again as a theme. And here is Cayce looking out, and he's not saying, oh, the Aztec had this problem, they had that problem. He's saying they were ruthlessly destroyed by Cortez. And in fact, that's the real record. In that preceding this, we had a combination of sources of a high civilization that was influenced by injection of forces from other channels, other sources, as will be seen or may be determined. From time as counted in the presence, we would turn back the clock to 10,600 years before the Prince of Peace comes into the land of promise. So we're talking about 10,550 BC, somewhere in there. And he finds a civilization being disturbed. We will find a civilization being disturbed by corruption from within to such measures that the elements, nature, join in bringing devastation to a stiff-necked and adulterous people. The second and third upheavals of Atlantis, there were individuals who left those lands and came to this particular portion when visible, Yucatan. But understand the surface was quite different then, that which would be viewed at the present. For example, rather than being a tropical area, it was more of temperate, quite varied in the conditions and positions in the face of the areas themselves. The weather was different, the way it looked was different, the currents were different. In following such a civilization as a historical presentation, it may be better understood by taking into consideration the activities of an individual. So let's go then to Atlantis Posadia, in particular, Iltar, the leader, with a group of followers that had been in the household of Atlan. So he is basically in Posadia before the destruction happens. And Posadia is right there in the Bimini area, and they were the last major stronghold of the Amilius group. They were using very high technology, but for spiritual purposes still. And then the last portion of Atlantis that went down. That's where Cayce said that the Temple of Posadia would rise again. So when we get into Iltar, what Cayce is saying is he was the top initiate, and he gets the word, basically, that destruction is happening, and he takes a small group of 100 and he goes off to the Yucatan and to rebuild and preserve the civilization just like Noah did. So he left this land, Posadia, and came westward, entering what would now be a portion of Yucatan, and there began with the activities of the peoples there, the development into a civilization that rose much in the same manner that had been in the Atlantean land. He did it, in fact. He had built the civilization up to the point of the Atlanteans. Others had left the land later, others earlier. There had been the upheavals also from the land of Mu, and these had their part in changing. There was the injection of the tenets of the various portions of the land. So we're getting a mixture of peoples coming into the Yucatan. The first temples that were erected by Iltar and his followers were destroyed at the period of change physically in the contours of the land. That now being found, and a portion of that already discovered, was laid in waste for many centuries, was a combination of those people from Mu, Oz, and Atlantis. Oz and Og are taken very often in the Cayce readings as an aspect of this great South America culture, and that culture was really the offshoot of the Atlanteans. Hence, these places partook of the earliest portions of the peoples called the Inca, though the Inca were themselves the successors to those of Oz or Og. So the Oz people, the Og people, they were first. They were pre-Mayan, pre-Inca, and everything. In the Peruvian land and Mu, in the southern portions of what is now called California and Mexico, this again found a change when there were the injections from those people that came with the division of those peoples called the Promised Land. Now, this gets directly to the Mormon story, because here Cayce is saying, during this period when the lost tribes took off, this is where they landed. So later, what you have is Iltar, in the beginning, after Atlantis, sets up this whole culture. And then later, you actually got this influence of the lost tribes coming over and setting up there. So you have the people from Atlantis, the people from Mu, and then later, the lost tribes of Israel. So I have to say that if you are following the Mormon story, this gives it a lot of heft. This does give it a lot of the background, because Cayce is saying, yeah, that is what happened. And the Mormons are saying the same thing. So there's some, there's some weirdness around the Mormon story, but this part seems to be right on. Okay, so he starts talking about their activities, and he talks about the stones that they use, which they set up these firestones. So listen closely. The stones that are circular, that were of the magnetized influence upon which the spirit of one spoke to those people as they gathered in their service, are of the earliest Atlantean activities in religious service. The altars upon which these were cleansings for the bodies of individuals, not human sacrifice. These were later the altars upon which individual activities, in which they would sacrifice hate, malice, selfishness, self-indulgence, these were cleansed from the body in the Iltar, what they set up there. And through the rise of initiates from the sources of light, okay, that came from the stones upon which the angels of light during the periods gave their expression to the peoples. So what's happening is, just like during the Atlantean period, these groups, these high initiate groups that are guiding the technology, are bringing in the saintly realm to get their information, and they're doing it in ceremony with the technology of the two-eye crystal. So the magnetized stones that Cayce is getting at here in Yucatan, that whole piece is talking about what Iltar had set up, which is the ability that to carry on from the Atlantean activity of connecting through the two-eye stone directly to those sources. So those are the higher sources. Those are the higher beings that they are communicating with. The Belial group destroyed Atlantis by using the same exact technology to basically cause a large-scale EMP nuclear-style event, particularly there in the hot zone. And at the end, Cayce says, well, they attuned the sources too high, and it just took everything down. So everything acted in reverse. You have so many things that act unusually in that area still, the magnetic anomalies. This is the apophthegm, this is the echo after the fact. The Egyptian priests and the Mayans, etc., were so careful with that information and not going back to the general culture and saying, hey, we're going to have flying machines, we're going to have all these things again. They decided it was too dangerous and that they would just work with a small group of initiates over time. This is where I think we start to get the story. So the hot zone Noah, Iltar, he set up the whole thing again in Yucatan. And so now we hear just yesterday about this large-scale discovery in Yucatan. Well, what do we know about Yucatan? It's one of the 3 sites that the Hall of Records that the Atlanteans left behind were buried. That's where they buried them in a temple in the Yucatan, according to Cayce. Iltar built one, and the first one actually was destroyed, so they built another one. That's how bad the earthquakes and the shifting of Earth was at that time. So the echo that we're getting from Bimini, and the Bimini Wall, and the lost cities off Cuba, and the discoveries in Yucatan, this is the reason for the secrecy around the hot zone. We're talking about the Atlantean information, which changes the entire background of the human civilization. That's crucial. That's why you see strange elites involved as well. That's why you have the whole Maxwell piece and the Belial cult and them taking the top scientists of the world under there in submarines, as we've done episodes on that in the hot zone, like Ghislaine in the hot zone. There's a reason why these groups keep that information secret. It's because there is a power to it. So here's Cayce, here's Steiner and Gurdjieff laying out this idea that, no, you know what, that piece of the Atlantean story, that's for culture to have, and that's for us to have. So this is, I think, a very crucial aspect. Before we leave Iltar and his unusual efforts to set up a new Atlantis, he does, but what happens is basically it becomes too much of a mixture, and so the cultures clash with each other, and Iltar and his followers move where? They move to Florida, and then they move to Mississippi, and then to Kentucky. And so the mound builders and all those pieces, that whole piece that we started with Bloomfield Moore, they are retracing the steps of Iltar, and that's where they're coming up. That's what these groups are looking for. It's the same reason why Lindbergh in his spare time was over the Yucatan spotting these ruins. It's because that group is very aware of the mystery school version of this, and they're looking for the same thing that Cayce's referring to here. A couple of quick things on the end of the story with Iltar. The pyramid, the altars before the doors of the varied temple activities, this is from the reading again, was an injection from the people of Oz and Mu, and will be found to be separate portions. That referred to in the scriptures high places of family altars, family gods, in many portions of the world became, again, the injection of the activities of groups in various portions, as basically these were the turning of the people to the satisfying or gratifying of self-desire. The Belial activities again entered the peoples respecting their associations. So when you get to the Aztec doing human sacrifice and things like that, it doesn't come anywhere from the original Atlantean intent. The Atlanteans brought forward that whole Mayan piece again, and then by the time that Mayan part phases out, we get into human sacrifice through the Aztecs, because the Belial forces have decided to move back in again, and they are using again this attunement ability, but now they're using that attunement for a totally different purpose. And then so they become very interested, Zentgraf, in the part where he mentions the lost tribe reaching this country. And he says, how did the lost tribe reach this country? And Cayce answers, in boats. And so that trip, as we know, across the Atlantic Ocean is actually very easy. And they've always made it in our traditional history. Oh, they couldn't do it. The Phoenicians couldn't go to Mexico. Would never happen. In fact, a number of different explorers have shown that those types of things ability. By what power, remember, we have this very elite group asking this question. Listen very carefully to the question. By what power or powers were these early pyramids or temples constructed? They want to know. By the lifting of forces that are being used gradually in the present civilization, and the fine work of activities of those versed in that pertaining to the source from which all power comes. For as long as there remain those pure in body and mind and activity, the law of the one God, there is the continued resources for meeting the needs or commanding the elements in their activities in the supply for that which is necessary. In which pyramid or temple are the records mentioned in the readings given through this channel on Atlantis? As given, the temple was destroyed at the time there was the last destruction in Atlantis. Yet as time draws nigh when those changes are to come about, there may be the opening in those three places where the records are one. This is the crucial part. To those that are the initiates in the knowledge of the one God, the temple by Iltar will then rise again, and also will the opening of the temple, the Hall of Records in Egypt, and those that were put into the heart of the Atlantean land will also be found there. For these have been kept and are of that group. The records are one. And then Cayce's like, I'm out. So there's a lot to unpack there. But what I want to grab is that Iltar, in setting up the Hall of Records the first time, the destruction happened and that forced the destruction of that. He set up another Hall of Records. That one's going to be discovered. The one off Bimini is going to be discovered, and the Egyptian one's going to be discovered. So when you hear about in Yucatan, now they're using the scan X-ray technology on the archaeological ruins, and they're finding these things. That they just found that one today. And then we know that they've been working on the Egyptian Hall of Records piece. And then there's the Bimini. We know that the Bimini Posadia temple's there. This is what he's laying out. These are the groups in Atlantis that preserved this information, and they wanted culture to move forward with it. This is the revelation of the Noah piece. And what happens is it's the Amilius group depositing this information all around. And what the group, the Belial cult, that's, goes as far even as the Epstein-Maxwell people being involved, as we pointed out in the Caribbean, that aspect is looking for the original, you want to say that original DNA strain that the Belial group was seeking from the Amilius beings in the first place. Somehow, this is how they've come in through this particular process. That's what they've been looking for. And this is a long-term aspect. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay. I'll start with an easy one. Okay, Lane Grief. When it says Noah was perfect in his generation, does that refer to untainted bloodline?
Well, you can look at it in a few ways. I mean, something Casey was just pointing out there is that once you basically have attuned yourself spiritually, the elements respond to you. So you become perfect in your generation. That means basically that, first of all, Noah comes out of that early mystery school tradition. He's learned the laws, and he's brought forward, the kind of spiritual reward on earth. The groups around him, that become the echo of those groups, become like the Hittites and everything is might is right. They're like the Belial groups, and they want to respond to what they can get physically on the earth plane. They're so coming from a very materialistic perspective. But what happened was, in that particular period of time, they were overwhelming the groups. So we're at a period like this now, but the dominance was such that everybody else's spiritual evolution was getting dominated by these small groups who had tremendous power. Sound familiar? Well, the Belial Amilius story is exactly like that. And we find ourselves again in the middle of it. Yeah.
Golden Girl says, regressive groups always trying to create slave clones for their personal uses. God's Truth War says, if those that created chimeric slaves with their own DNA will necessarily incarnate into those forms, what does that say about your DNA being harvested/used, like 23andMe and abductees?
Yeah, well, there's something very interesting about what Dr. Farrell added on 23andMe and those types of things, which is that we already know that the CEO for 23andMe realized that it was like a bad scene and was trying to get out of that company. And they've already, had tremendously tanked results because they've been handing over to law enforcement all these DNA things. So it's not a safe process by any stretch of the imagination. That's one dimension of it. But think about this other dimension, if Dr. Farrell is correct, that those groups are looking for certain strands of DNA. And if they show up in a test like that, then they become, surveilled based on who they are. There's no question in my mind that they look for those types of things. Just like there are groups that participate in these archaeological wars. They aren't things, it's very hard to get data on them, except strange things happen. Like when the Walmart founder ended up with the original Enki stone from the Sumerian texts. And it was like, where did this guy get this thing? So that was looted out of the Baghdad Museum and shut up in as part of the Walmart thing. So we know, like Carnegie, for example, was obsessed with dinosaur findings. And anytime there was a dinosaur discovery, he and his team had to be there. And they would spare no expense. And he was absolutely fixated on it. But if you go into the Cayce readings, you're going to find something strange about the dinosaurs, which is it looks like they were reanimated as a kind of early Jurassic Park in the Atlantean era. So there's these people may have been looking at this stuff and saying, we want to do our own experiments with it. but we've seen them control aspects of history in that way. They've found the bodies of giants at times, for example, and they've suppressed those through the Smithsonian and things of that nature. They don't want people knowing that history. They want a very controlled history where, you have these dumb cavemen who didn't know anything, and then we became very smart, and we're so great. And that everyone else is pesky, and we're the smart elite. That's really what they're going for. That story is absurd, and the Neanderthal aspect of that story blows it away. So the mystery schools give us something else to work with that's different from the scientific palette. So bringing those two together is fascinating. The first thing is dinosaurs in traditional history annihilated 65 million years ago. Mayan artifacts, 1000 BC, children playing with dinosaurs. How do you get that? There's no cultural memory that's going to last 65 million years. Somebody had reanimated those dinosaurs, or even if you want to go a step further, our idea of them being eliminated 65 million years ago is just wrong. After all, when did those theories get found out? When did they get really settled? When we had no technology to actually check this stuff out. So just like the Egyptian history is founded on what? 18th, 19th century type of research? I think we can do a lot better than that now. They're still sticking with the dating of, the Great Pyramid of 2000 BC. We can probably do better. They don't want to throw that out because, one, they don't want to share it. And two, there's a certain kind of power dynamic that comes from them just saying, oh, we were right all along. And so I've talked with very frustrated people, people like Graham Hancock and others who've gone through that. And, it's just like a strange, they're sure of themselves. And, the archaeological associations and the rest, they don't want to monkey with that because they sit on top of this whole thing that depends on this house of cards. But if you start to find out, 10,500 BC, Rata founded culture in Egypt after leaving Atlantis, it throws all the history that they have out the window. So I think it is crucial for us to regain that history coming from a totally different place. Yes.
Frank Monday, the tar pits in California, they found human bones under dinosaur bones.
Yeah, those are interesting. There's also the shoe prints that are like over 1 million years old. What are you going to do with those? You get into Michael Cremo's work, you're talking about something that's totally different. And I will say this, that fundamentally on the Cayce side, he talks about basically the Atlanteans forming the culture that they had 200,000 BC. Okay, so that gives us some idea. 200,000 years ago is when that wave of the Atlantis culture hit. So we have that, at least. I think that's some kind of foundation. I want to show you something real quick on this as well. We've got here 3 very interesting and important people. You can probably make out some of them. This is very important because it goes to how secrets are hidden and how ancient knowledge is sought among very high-level circles, and how that search does not reach the public. But there might be windows in which we can find it. First person, of course, is Albert Einstein. He wrote a favorable intro for Charles Hapgood's book on pole shifts. This is very interesting, sticking his neck out. Over here is Edgar Cayce, who talked about how pole shifts played a part in ancient destruction and that we had one coming up. Hapgood became obsessed with pole shift coming, and Einstein agreed with him that it was possible. Hapgood was very obsessed with the Cayce readings, and when he was working with the ARE for a while, he decided that Cayce's son, Hugh Lynn Cayce, wasn't really taking the information and the research in the edgy direction that Cayce had laid out on the Atlantis side. And he decided to try to kind of go it alone. And he wound up working with a psychic named Babbitt, who we did an episode on. and he tried to do readings that were like Cayce's, and they didn't reach the level of the Cayce work by any stretch of the imagination. But Hapgood had the scientific side, and he had the spiritual side through the Cayce readings. Now, Hapgood went to President Eisenhower and said, you know what? Actually, there's a totally different map of Antarctica that exists. And it's the same one that is the source for the Piraeus map. And I know where to get it, but it's part of the Spanish government. You have to help me get it. So I want to read this. This is actually a letter from Hapgood to Eisenhower, and I'm going to tell you an interesting follow-up on this. 1960 memo to President Eisenhower revived a centuries-old quest, locating the lost map of Columbus. Okay. President Eisenhower from Charles Hapgood, professor of history. Read the Piraeus map, 1513, and the lost map of Columbus. By the way, Hapgood was invited and had been at the White House 3 different times. The map is referred to by Columbus' contemporaries and by historian Las Casas as one to use to navigate to the New World. In 1929, a map was discovered by the former imperial palace, Seraglio, in Constantinople, authored by a Turkish admiral of the 16th century, Piraeus. In the inscriptions written on this map, the author states that the western part, showing the American coast, was copied from a map that had been in the possession of Christopher Columbus, but which had fallen into the hands of Piraeus, and the booty seized from 8 Spanish ships captured by him in a battle off the coast of Valencia in 1501. In Piraeus' map, a copy of which accompanies this memorandum, attracted the attention of President Kemal Ataturk of the American and also of the American Secretary of State Henry Stimson, who in 1932 asked the Turkish government for a color facsimile of the map. He wanted to see what the deal was. In 32. And a search of Turkish archives and collections to see if the lost map of Columbus might not be found. The facsimile of the map now hangs in the map division of the Library of Congress, but the original Piraeus worked from, Columbus's own map, or a copy of it, was never found. We now have an excellent reason to believe that the original map still exists in the Spanish archives. The reason that this map has remained so long undiscovered appears to be simply that it's very different from other contemporary maps and not at all what scholars would expect to find in a map of Columbus. So he goes into it, and basically the upshot is that it shows, it's that whole bit about Antarctica. In Piraeus, you know, that map shows Antarctica with no ice on it. Well, this is the map from which he got it from. And what's fascinating about this, I'll skip ahead on it. In addition to the important purpose of clearing up many mysteries relating to the discovery of America, we have another purpose in asking that a search be made for this map now. Studies of the map by various scholars have shown that it contains many details that were not known to geographers in 1513. These indicate that the map must descend from maps made in very ancient times, before the Christian era. This, of course, tends to support the tradition that Columbus brought a map from the Old World. It seems that Columbus left the Old World with quite a good map of America in his pocket. This is, again, that whole idea that they already knew about America, was already here, and that whole thing about Columbus finding it. And he's saying that these navigators discovered and explored the coast of America a millennium before the Christian era. And he's writing this to Eisenhower. Okay, so I'll wrap this up. The most remarkable detail of the Piraeus map indicating its enormous age was pointed out by Captain Arlington Mallory. Some glacial topography. He stated that the lower part of the map showed subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land, Antarctica, and the Palmer Peninsula. After 4 years of study of the map, we come to recognize that Captain Mallory's statement was correct, but desiring the most authoritative checking out of our conclusions, we submitted a data to the cartographic staff of Strategic Air Command. And then they come back and they say, oh yeah, this is definitely Antarctica without the ice on it. How did they do this back then? So they're all kind of whipped into this thing. And at the end, he says the most important step in the process at the present time is to push the search to Spain for the map that was the replica of the Santa Maria during the summer of 1893. Success in this search will make it possible to rewrite in a fundamental way the history of the discovery of America. But there's a key under there, which is the whole Antarctica piece. Now, here's what's fascinating. The upshot of this is the stories after the fact is that Eisenhower hit up the Spanish archives for this, and they didn't want to give it to him. And so at a certain point, Eisenhower even threatens them with a loss of aid if they don't hand it over. And there's no other word about whatever happened to this thing. So Hapgood brings it up. Einstein is there backing him in his work. Hapgood comes directly out of the Cayce tradition of the pole shift and everything else, and is associated with the ARE. And there we have right in the middle of it, history in the making. So that, I think, is crucial for us to understand. Look, they obviously got their hands on that map. And those groups there, somebody didn't want Eisenhower to have that because the Hapgood letter was basically exposing what the map was all about. So just like in the Vatican archives, there are things that relate directly to Atlantis that would clear up a lot of these mysteries relating to it. These groups already know and are already working from that. They already know what took place, and they're already seeking out their own answers in their own research. That's where you get things like the Maxwell Belial cult. That's where you get the secrecy that's so heavy around the hot zone. So that's just kind of an aside that brings in Hapgood.
Yes. Madri, could the Epstein crowd and the Commonwealth, could they also be looking for gold in the hot zone?
Yeah, there's resources. Look what you get when you get around the hot zone. I mean, there's all kinds of resources. There's incredible drug running. There's human trafficking. There are a lot of reasons to be there. The gold aspect came up in the Cayce readings, and he said there's more gold under Bimini than in the world's circulation today. That's pretty heavy duty. So that does give them incredible incentive to check it out. Apparently, they haven't discovered it, but I would say this, that the secrecy around the ruins is the biggest secret going on in the hot zone, especially since at a certain point, President Kennedy, with the help of Gordon Cooper, went looking for those ruins over the aspect of just checking out, under the cover of, oh, hey, keep an eye on those nukes that are in Cuba and things of this nature. So they know that that's one level of thing they have to deal with. But there's this whole other thing, which is dealing with these ruins. The question is the level of the knowledge of what those ruins represent. Somebody knew something. That's why Thomas Townsend Brown spent all those months off the western tip of Cuba studying the white sand, as I found out through his daughter, and why right off that same western tip in the hot zone is that incredible Paulina Zalitsky discovery of the Cuban city, which is Atlantis underwater. But it's not just a pyramid or something like that. It's a metropolis, according to her. So you've got a totally different version of reality there. That means even, however you want to think about Atlantis or anything else, there, off Cuba, underwater, that means at least 10,000, 12,000 years ago, you're looking at a whole culture that existed. And it was a metropolis. And according to her, it looked like a Mayan city. And she mentioned that, in fact, in the submersible pictures that came back, the hieroglyphs, there were hieroglyphs, and the person automatically was like, oh, they're Egyptian hieroglyphs? And she's like, no, they're just like the Mexican pyramid ones. So that whole piece between Cuba and Yucatan that sank is a missing chapter. It might be the piece right after Atlantis, by the way. But according to Cayce, it's that area is Posadia, and that's the last real stronghold of the Amilius group. So this would lend itself to extreme secrecy. That's where you get the secrecy around the hot zone. And the way we've laid it out in so many programs, with the involvement going back to Hemingway and all the rest of it, all of it is ongoing. I always see the same type of mysterious strains of secrecy around the hot zone. And, often there are cover stories like, oh, we're looking for blue sinkholes. You have all these billionaires around the same place. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Branson is one of them. Yeah.
David Tormina, DJ, are the mystery schools keeping the sunken pyramid ruins a secret because they are secretly using the lost technology as a means to observe the timelines and preserve their elite status?
I think they're obsessed with having this. I think that it relates to a Superman quality for them. Just like the Belial group wanted to discover the secret of the Amilius DNA, how they could project themselves instead of have normal birth. That's odd. It's an odd little chapter and reference there that basically the Belial group was kind of jealous fundamentally of the Amilius group. They wanted to know how they were doing things on this level. Amilius, as Cayce describes Amilius, is basically like a Christ figure who comes into Atlantis to these groups that have projected themselves and locked themselves into materiality. So he's coming in to lead the way out. And so we see this pattern again. By the time you get to Christ, there's that pattern, I'm leading you out. Just like you can find the pattern in the Moses story where, I'm leading you out of Egypt 40 years in the desert, right, to wander. And then we find the promised land. That whole thing, when you get to Jesus, he's doing the same thing, but it's on a much higher level. He's leading you out of the captivity of death into the promised land of resurrection and these things. So we have to, if we understand, if we have the esoteric sunglasses on when we're looking at these things, they make a lot more sense, just like the Noah story does. So I think that they do feel that the possession of this technology would make them Superman. That's why I think they do a lot of what they do. But there's a deep background on it. Just like if you go around, as we pointed out in the Colonel in the Hot Zone, you're going to find Marvin Minsky closely associated with the daughter of Colonel Sanders. And then you find the Cousteau, they're trying to exploit Cousteau's granddaughter. And why would they be trying to do that? They're trying to blackmail her to get the information that Cousteau had from his 50 years of trips in the hot zone underwater. They want that information and they want to use methods to get it. But when you look at somebody like Minsky and the level he's involved, he's an MIT genius, right? And what did the Epsteins do? They always went to these geniuses, the Epstein-Maxwell gang, and they were always surrounded by the top scientific brass. So it's not just a politically motivated blackmail game. They want something that is scientific in nature. Yes.
Dash Rendar, connection between twins and Atlantis DNA experiments. Mengele escaped to Brazil. Now entire towns there have very high rates of twins. NASA is also doing twin studies, cloning or doppelgangers.
Oh, well, that's really fascinating. If you really study those stories, Mengele used a different name and went into these different towns. And then all of these towns started having these remarkable twins. I think it's just a continuation of the Nazi experiments there to achieve this kind of super experiment through twins. They were looking for a perfected type of being. And they were, remember, deeply involved with the whole Atlantean mythos of this higher culture. They had a whole group determined to go out and find the high, I mean, they didn't call it DNA at the time because it hadn't been discovered, but they were looking for that racial superiority through understanding that they were part of the Superman group. I'm going to read you something about Cayce's version of the things. It comes from Edgar Cayce and Atlantis. It might give us some idea about the scientific side and how we can regard what the things were. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep, deep here in the Atlantean Amilius, Noah's Ark aspect, and we're taking your questions now. We're going to go some more for a while here with Miss Olivia taking your questions. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com while we have this little intermission and sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already. That'll keep us in touch and gets us past the incredible censorship that we've been seeing. Also, get behind the show, subscribe, be a part of what we're doing here. We're going to have some remarkable things coming up for you this summer. Blow your mind as it's going to blow ours. And it's great to have so many of you with us. And by subscribing, you will have access to a number of things that we have coming up. And so you want to be there first and stand up and be counted. We appreciate your support. With that, I'm going to read this piece now. And this is Cayce on Atlantis. And this is talking about the things. So we start to understand and regard the things, how they were seeing them. And this whole idea of these cyborgs kind of trapped in matter because of the Atlantean scientists through the Belial group. He says, in giving the interpretation of the records, we find it as well that there be given something in the background so there will not be confusion. For in giving the experience of an entity's sojourn in a period called Atlantis or Posadia, there's oft confusion in the interpretation of the records as to whether Posadia was the land or Atlantis was the land. There were also other centers that were developing, for in the projections they began as many, and in creating influence they began as 5, or in those centers where crystallization or projection had taken as such forms as to become what was called man, though it hardly could be said that they were in the exact form as in the present. He's talking about the early projections into matter. So in following or interpreting the Poseidian period, or in Atlantis, let it be understood that this was only one of the groups, and the highest or the greatest advancement in the early sojourn of the individual or entities or souls of that particular period. So there's a number of different groups that are operating there. It's just the Atlanteans turn out to be the kind of highest, most gifted. And then just a little insight on the Belial group. So the sons of Belial sought the gratifying, the satisfying, the use of material things for self without thought or consideration as to the sources of such, nor the hardships and the experience of others. Or in other words, like the political leadership today, we would term it today that they were without a standard of morality. The sons of Belial had no standard save of self-aggrandizement. The Amilius group understood that the soul was given by the creator or entered from outside sources into the projection of the mental and spiritual self of the given period. That was the standard of the law of one. It was rejected by the sons of Belial. So this clash on Earth, we're still seeing it. And so those who are dedicated to the scientific materialism are still in power. That's the whole Davos meeting thing that we saw rolling out. They're still dedicated. They want to control the Earth by these means. So that's where you get the Klaus Schwab thing, the whole Stepford Biden thing, and what we're living on, Department of Homeland Security, the whole Central Intelligence apparatus. This is where that whole thing is coming from. So we have to understand that for them, they're not operating on a standard. And that's very crucial. This other piece, I think, is also important. This is a prediction, and it talks about this piece. I've tried to get on the record and make sure that we're paying attention to, which is all about land rising. So we have to get with this. What a lot of these readings and mystery schools are telling us is that land is rising, and that these other groups around the world are aware of this. So we brought this up on a number of occasions about how people had bought lots in the Atlantic Ocean for land that's rising, because if you grab that land and it's in an open area, you could start your own civilization, basically, and you won't be encumbered by the powers around you. It's anybody's to get. And it represents a massive shift in how we do things. Now, this group that we see complaining all about climate change and doing all these types of things after they destroyed the environment and they put Kerry out there and all that stuff, this whole thing is set up. They're based. They know that land is rising. So a lot of what the moves that they're making are based on a knowledge that we don't have our hands on. So something that the mystery schools and the Cayce work is saying is there's land rising. So how does that change the equation for what we're looking at? So this idea that, lands are going underwater because of coastal rise, the other piece of that is lands are rising. And by the way, some of that's natural, some of it's man-made. Certainly there are environmental issues. I think in the alternative space, we should talk about the environmental part, because the corporations have destroyed a lot of the environment, and it's crucial for a sustainable future, not to have the kind of pollution levels that we have. But listen to this. This is from the Earth Changes Update book from 1979. An earthquake measuring 8.0 on the Richter scale rocked the eastern tip of the Indonesian province of Irian Jaya on Wednesday, destroying half the houses in one town. Interior Department spokesman Faisal Tamin said there was no immediate word on the fate of 8,000 residents in the devastated town of Ensis. Tasman said major damage was also caused in the town of Siroy. And what happens is, as a result of this, 2 eyewitnesses saw an island more than a mile long, 100 yards wide, and as high as 125 feet emerge from the Pacific off the coast of Ecuador. So this is in the same time frame. You have this massive earthquake going on, and then this other part of the world, this other thing happens. Okay. Walter Camacho, director of the Coastal Polytech School, investigated the story Friday, confirmed the island's birth. 2 eyewitnesses to the island's birth on Sunday said it was heralded by a trembling of the earth and strange underground noises. The location is 36 miles off of Coroquez Bay in the Manabi province. Land rising. Do you ever hear about land rising? Do you ever hear about islands coming up? They don't really report on this. Here's a report from 1979. This is something that happens that you don't hear about, but it's crucial to the Bimini aspect of the Cayce story. Land rising. We have to get it on, the radar. This has to be a talking point. It has to be the thing that we go after and talk about. Land is rising. And where are the scientific studies that are being blocked out around this? Where do we get that information? And how crucial is it to the things that we see happening? Yes.
Twilight, does Göbekli Tepe relate to Atlantis?
Well, the era, they had said, one of the things that they said about the Cayce work, it's great, he could talk about 10,000 BC, but I don't find any pot shards, and, there's nothing from that era that represents a civilization. So they used that line for years, while also ripping off his own research to look for the Hall of Records themselves in Egypt. And it was 2 Egyptologists that were saying this about Cayce. One of them who had been funded by the Cayce family initially. That's another weird thing, which is the Cayce organization has funded a lot of these people who've turned out to be real turncoats. That's another sloppy management aspect of what they've done. And some of those jokers, like Zahi Hawass, still go to the ARE, and I can't understand how the ARE can even tolerate those people after all the bashing, And he's taken a lot of money from the Cayce Foundation to find the Hall of Records, and he's never shown them anything. So he's probably just taken the money and done the research for himself. So you have a lot of real nasty players like that. Let's not forget that Hawass was part of the Mubarak government, which got thrown out. So, you have some dicey players around this archaeological piece for sure. Yes.
David Donaway, are the sociopathic venal greed monsters who control us adepts? Talk with DJ about the possibility that elites direct their own incarnations. Was this true with Atlanteans?
Well, this is a crucial piece, and this must be also pretty well guarded in mystery circles, because I used to wonder how these people could go through their lives knowing the things that they were doing, like the type of elitist things that we've talked about. And, just if they don't believe in anything and go off a cliff, what's kind of the point? To leave some kind of legacy for their family, or to say that some of them don't even have families? So I started to wonder what they were doing. And if you dig into that enough, you will find the idea of guiding incarnations is certainly a possibility. That enters into the eighth sphere aspect, because supposedly, and this goes into a cosmology around Steiner's work, but if somebody incarnates and takes a misstep through the normal incarnation and gets diverted by Ahriman into the eighth sphere, they can come back here immediately, basically, but they'll come back, crude in a sense, without the development that they're meant to go on to and come back with. So that gets us into some levels of how to look at this. But if you think about how the mystery schools on both sides knew that Blavatsky was coming, that means that they understand certain types of astronomical functions representing who's coming and going. Here's the other piece of that. If you look at what the mystery schools call Armageddon, and that's the same meaning as the biblical Armageddon. In biblical Armageddon, it's the ultimate war, right? And they've interpreted it in religious circles as a nuclear war. It's just Armageddon's coming. But if you go deep on the mystery school side, especially in Cayce's work, he says Armageddon is the war in the air. That's what it means. So it's the souls, he said, don't misunderstand, it's the souls returning to and the souls exiting the earth. So somehow they're setting up a group of souls to block the good influence of these higher initiates that want to incarnate here. That's Armageddon. So there's definitely knowledge about who's entering and who's leaving, and there's conscious interference. Can they actually plan when they reincarnate? I actually think that they must have that ability, or they wouldn't do a number of the things that they do. So if it existed back then, certainly I think if it exists now, it existed back then, yes. Go ahead.
Karen Carpenter, does DJ think there's tech to read frequencies of incoming souls?
I think that certain types of tech have always existed. Look, there's a very interesting, if you go deep on Cayce on this, they asked Cayce kind of, they had this book back then, which is about a pyramid prophecy thing. And there weren't that many of those back then. It was kind of like, that really got into gear in the 70s, but we're talking about 1930s. And they said, so-and-so has decided, who was like a scientific person, that there are predictions based on measurements in the pyramid. And Cayce said, yeah, I mean, this guy has overshot what he thinks is going on. But there are, it is a predictive machine in that sense. And they said, well, how does it predict anything? Like what's the function? And he said, basically through the architecture itself, for those who know how to read the steganography, and the type of stone that's used, even the curve for something going into these different halls, for example. So they said, well, are those prophecies accurate? Is there a reason to even study how to do them? Are the prophecies accurate? And Cayce said, well, if you know how to read it, it goes down to the date of the person being born, the name of the family that they're born into, and the street that they grow up on. How's that for accurate? So the pyramid has that technology built into it. So how does that work? So there's a gigantic psychic thing that comes through the knowledge of the pyramids, which, if you learn how to read it, can tell you the entire world's history and also the history that's to come. And that the period that we're in, this 21st century, is entering into the king's chamber. And the interpretation is of the empty sarcophagus that the understanding of death will be made plain. So that's the spiritual opportunity. That's a pretty high level for us to be at, in fact. So I can see why, in a way, the small group, the harmonic powers that are controlling humanity are going crazy, because if this is a period for us to discover that, that, there is no death, just a kind of a spiritual transition. And that's what the whole empty tomb is about. And the pyramid has nothing to do with Pharaoh's tomb. That's dramatic. In fact, Cayce had talked about how Jesus, when he took the last of his brotherhood mystery school rites with John the Baptist, which they both did through the Essenes, that Jesus spent 3 nights in that tomb, in the pyramid, and did the whole dying and coming back to life thing as part of the initiation. That's what they did in that school. And finally, when Jesus becomes Christ, he does the real thing. He doesn't just do it as part of an initiation ritual. He is killed, and raises that body up because he's overcome the earth. This is a real you're talking about the apex of the Great White Brotherhood's efforts on Earth through the Great Pyramid. So yeah, it's a tremendous technology in that sense that you're describing, and that just gives us a hint, maybe, that all the world's destinies are recorded there. How do they do that? Go ahead.
I'm gonna get controversial for a second.
Oh, yeah.
Super Fighter. If you have mRNA in you, can you be perfect in your generations? Third Eye says the mRNA alters your DNA. You are no longer classified as an unmodified human being. No human rights validity. Property of the patent owners. Their mark.
Yeah, I remember it was very interesting. I had a conversation with Joseph Farrell. I think we were talking in 2013. And he said that the whole thing about the alien stuff and all of the weirdness around it is that they were going to create this idea that if these alien groups had some interference with humanity's DNA, that they could actually trademark that DNA and come back and say, that's our property, basically. Which I'll tell you was a remarkable thing for him to talk about. That's what so much of that reminds me of. So that's where I go with that. Whenever somebody goes into that, we'll own you through your DNA thing, I go directly to the alien op piece that they want to use. And so that's how I look at that. I always thought, there's a very scientific thing there also with abductions. And I don't think that I actually think we need to get back in a way to the culture of the 80s and 90s around the UFO thing. And not as a regressive thing, but there was a thread in that work that got dismissed, I think. And it was understanding the alien interaction with the abduction experience, the interaction scientifically that was going on there. You never hear much about that anymore. All you ever hear about the UFO thing is people saying, it's like Q. Remember Q? Like there was supposed to be a big Q drop the next day, right? It's like, boom, boom, get ready. Tomorrow's going to be the big one. Hillary's going to jail or something. Now the alien UFO field, they've done the same thing to them. They've made it like a Q-bot thing. So now you have Corbell saying, watch out, Department of Defense dropping the big one on Friday, here it comes. And it's always some like weird beach ball attacking, a Navy ship. It's like stupid footage. They don't even have good footage. I'm amazed with this op around the UFO thing that they've used such crap footage. It's actually, they must really think that the public are just suckers, because that's some of the worst footage I've ever seen. There's much better real UFO footage. And it makes you wonder, they don't want to let anything real out. They like this kind of, part of it is, I think the manufactured stuff gives them plausible deniability, because they can always say, oh, this was a crap thing. We decided that it wasn't the real thing upon further study. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Aliens Among Us. I remember this guy. He had some interesting things to say. I want to tell you about something. I'm going to take a little aside, if you allow me, Miss Olivia. This is Rudolf Steiner, the founder of Anthroposophy, who started spiritual science and the work of biodynamic farming, eurythmy, theater. My goodness, so many things have come out of the Steiner work. Now, we know about Steiner through the work that we've done in this program. There's so much of his work to absorb, and I highly recommend it. If you want to learn anything about the mystery schools, you have to have the Steiner piece. And I highly recommend G.G. Young's work in relation to this. But I want to tell you something strange going on. And Steiner has always had and always been targeted by black magic, black occult groups. And his movement has. As a matter of fact, when they burned down the Goetheanum, that was a whole mass ritual against him. And the Nazis didn't want the competition, as one of the reasons they destroyed that. But recently, this thing has been going around, and I want to cause attention to it. It is, somebody has taken the time, and I've seen it a lot, of making Steiner into the Joker and putting that around as a weird meme. I see this everywhere. What the hell is going on with that? Who's behind that? Who made it? I get another feeling like we're looking at groups communicating with each other. I don't think it's just a lark, oddly enough. I think it's a weird thing to do. I don't think somebody would pick Steiner up and put the Joker on him. I think that's literally a work. And I've got 18 different pictures of this that somebody has done. That's weird. So, I know that the Waldorf schools had their own target on their back during the vaccine thing. They try to remove tax status and all kinds of weird things that they were doing with them. But I also think that there's something going around, and I wanted to catch it early in relation to the Steiner piece, that there's some warped kind of low occult groups that are offended by Steiner's presence and his reemergence, really, which is happening. And it's happening here. It's happening through, it's in the zeitgeist, and we're bringing that voice, the very powerful voice, back. But I will say what's interesting is, even when Steiner was poisoned, things, there was this celebration of Black Mass type groups in America. That's what we find out when we go back and look at that. So I don't know. Steiner's the Joker is really weird. Very, very strange. So if you see that, let's share that kind of information, because I think that's coming from a very, very
do you think they're dangling that so that people like us will actually use it, and sort of share it and create memes about it, and so that they can link Steiner in a negative way with groups that won't go along with their ops?
Well, I followed opposition to Steiner for a while, and it often would focus, it would be like, oh, it's racist, and they would always associate it with something else called Archaeologists, which is a Nazi, pre-Nazi occult thing. It has nothing to do with Anthroposophy. It just sounds like it, Archaeologists, Anthroposophy. So, but you see that push against Steiner, because what does the Steiner work recommend at its heart? It talks about an organized social order. It talks about separating spiritual ideals from scientific materialism. And it talks about the great clash of the harmonic powers coming in through the eighth sphere. If people really listen to that stuff, then they're going to have quite a leg up for dealing with what these people are rolling out on this high level. So the Joker thing I thought was weird, and I didn't think that was just some one-off weirdo, especially since, first of all, it's an unusual thing to do. Second of all, Steiner is relatively obscure in a lot of ways, especially for meme makers. And the other thing is the extent of them, that there are so many of them that I found, like I said, I have 18 different versions of that thing. So, if it were just somebody being a weirdo, then that's, that's pretty weird. But I took it a little bit differently. And I think that I look at these groups as looking at someone like Steiner as a real problem for their future, and bringing that knowledge forward around Steiner. Look, Steiner, through the early childhood education of the Waldorf school, has already prepared a whole group of individuals to face off against this thing coming in for the 21st century, the harmonic thing that we find ourselves in the middle of. And those children and those schools, how do they look at somebody like Bill Gates? He must almost appear like a Frankenstein monster to them if you have the sight, from studying these things. So I do think, and I would keep an eye on Steiner as a target for these groups. I've seen enough of it, to give me that impression. Yes.
Erica Swinson Elliott says Steiner is over the target.
Yes, exactly. And especially if this is his prediction that the era is exactly right. So this is Steiner almost as Nostradamus, which is 100 years and we're back in. It seems very much like we're back in the soup with anthroposophy and the opportunity that the mystery schools mentioned. And, it's not like a superstitious thing. I want it to be understood as, and for us to think about it as a cycle, And that's how these mystery groups work. And I can tell you from studying a lot of these different mystery groups that the ones that we focus on for the X series, the Steiner work, Theosophy, Edgar Cayce, and the Gurdjieff work, really stand out dramatically. It's not that other people haven't done good work, but these are so foundationally transformative that I think they represent a real, a real way to move the culture and a real development, spiritually and otherwise. I mean, it's interesting to think about some of the things that Theosophy has accomplished. These weren't people that are just dreaming off on a mountaintop, although that sounds pretty nice. I mean, the liberation of India came about through Besant and Gandhi. So, I mean, these are pretty dramatic things. Well, who did Gandhi inspire? Martin Luther King Jr. So this is how these things need to be understood, I think. And I like them in their, kind of woo category. It doesn't bother me, actually, but to understand them deeper is more important. Yes.
Did Cayce ever do a reading for someone who had been one of these cyborg beings?
He did talk about someone that Rata personally had taken to the Temple Beautiful and moved them through. And it's funny the way he just describes moving them out of this mixed status and bringing them into full spirituality, because he said that there were movements and dances and songs involved. So it gets quite deep. So I would say the answer is yes. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a series of questions around it. I think that he goes back to a period where it says you were with Rata when you had these kind of appendages and you were blended. You were one of these blended mixtures that the Belial group had created. And Rata brought you through the Temple Beautiful through this whole process. And they used things to burn qualities out of people, including stringed instruments. Isn't that interesting? Doesn't that bring you to a whole different level of understanding music? So there's something quite unusual going on there. Apparently, also in that regard, there was tremendous hatred of the Atlanteans when they came into Egypt, because they came in with all these cyborg slaves, the things, the human machines, however you want to see them, as human-animal mixtures or technological mixtures. They weren't quite fully human, and there are people who come through the Cayce readings who had lives where they were kind of championing these groups of these beings that were created without thought or purpose, but which still had apparently that human DNA in them. So they had the spark of the spirit. So Cayce's bringing that through as Rata, bringing that quality back up out of them.
We don't have the benefit of the Temple of Sacrifice, the Temple Beautiful now. But it seems to me that purification is needed desperately.
Oh, yeah.
We are being bombarded and attacked from all kinds of energetic levels, chemical levels, etc. And I mean, you could look at it as the ascension group, right? But even just on a basic level, how are we going? What we can honestly say about a human being is that we are a vessel for energy. So if we want our soul to incarnate in a healthy way and be embodied and fulfill our potential, we're always focused on the outside. We're always focused on, and making predictions about the NWO and what they're up to and everything. And that's natural. But what we actually have power over is something like our own purification, our own energy, how we are embodied. What do you say? What would Cayce say about what we can do to empower ourselves now?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the whole attunement service part that we were talking about with it. Purification is pretty interesting. I mean, you've run across a lot of native rituals for things like that. And I think it's quite fascinating, because something like that is like resetting your entire energy body for what you want to do. So somehow the force of your intention really purifies everything that you do in that sense. And I would say that there must be at least one or two different types of kind of rituals that you would do in this type of period, like that are very different than something that would happen, say, 100 years ago if somebody wanted to have that kind of attunement. And this is why I get so deep into the work around Rudolf Steiner, because he's looking off into what we're going to face in the 21st century. And in facing that battle that we are there through the technology, in facing with our souls and our humanity, this thing comes in, and this force. What is it that we need in this particular period of time? Maybe a certain type of community would be required in the 19th century. We've talked about groups like Anthroposophy getting together and doing these things together and creating, biodynamic farming, things like that. What do you do in the 21st century for it? It seems to me more than almost all the other groups, it is the Steiner's work that looks out into what we're facing with Ahriman. If you look at what we have with Theosophy, Theosophy basically says, in the future, what's coming, you are going to see, the sixth root race. They're going to be psychic. They're going to get along with each other. And the world is going to be kind of a spiritual metropolis. Things are going to go really quite well. And that sounds great. The problem is the war, the battle that takes place between the soulless technology, harmonic spirit trying to dominate through the eighth sphere is missing. It's like, it's just a chapter that's not there that they don't deal with. So this is something that's so fascinating about Steiner's work. He also says, yeah, humanity is going to a good place, but you're going to face this. And when you face off against this, then what? You need to be not run from Ahriman, not run from the evil things, but to take them on directly yourself. And when you do that, when you face them, you're acquiring for higher powers. You're acquiring for Christ the ability of Ahriman. So this is really important and goes deep into the cosmological aspects. But I think that's when I think about what's purifying and when I think about what's preparatory, it has something to do with that Steiner work and letting us know, yes, you're going to face this in the 21st century, but somehow in our activity being aware of it, even in the, as we're aware of it here in the ideas room, that there's that powerful piece. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just going to add that really the thing is, we in the West do not like to talk about discipline,
Yes.
But in all the spiritual traditions, it's necessary for soul growth and,
Oh, yeah.
higher manifestation. And I hate to say it, I put myself, being an empath, I put myself in the shoes of the elite a lot. And I think of how they see us and how they justify what they do by seeing our weaknesses. And,
their judgment.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and it's easy to read their minds, right? And why they don't respect us. And ultimately, on some level, why we don't respect ourselves, right? So we have to demand of ourselves a greater level of discipline. So to become a true human being, to reach our potential. And then we can if I had to stand toe to toe to, Schwab, Bill Gates, whoever, right? And say, and really justify, like, you have no power over me, right? You are no better than I am. And I can tell you why. I can't do that today,
well, see, this
but
is
I can imagine what it would take for me to do that.
Absolutely. Here's what's fascinating about what you said. I think about the people that I know who are around, let's say, Wall Street, for example. And they have this thing about Lloyd Blankfein, and that he did Goldman Sachs, and he's a great person. Wow. He's so wealthy, and he ran Goldman Sachs to this incredible organization. And now you know what he does? He saves Patagonia, the environment. Now, I know from my own ability to research things financially that Lloyd Blankfein's policies have been responsible for destroying people's lives in America and all around the world. So when they did the financial coup in 2008, so many people lost their homes because they were suckered in by the type of assets that Goldman Sachs had set up. These very strange packages where they were hoping people would fail in their mortgage and get thrown out of their homes. So when your work is set up around destruction, but you amass an incredible wealth, you're able to carefully project yourself. So those people that I knew who worked around Wall Street, they all saw Blankfein as not only a big champion with the incredible billions that he made, but also as an incredible environmental warrior. And we can tell from just studying his history that neither are true, right? He was obsessed with destroying people's lives. Goldman Sachs had a deep role in destroying the farms in India and the locally run farms to centralize the food production that was going on in India. And in the process, destroying those people's lives who had lived out in the country. So that's what those people are really all about. But the image making that goes on top and the way that suckers buy into it, these are smart people, so this is how they thought of it. But yeah, really, I mean, that's basically how I think of it.
We know this from innumerable movies and TV shows where there's some kind of a mob guy, who's dealing drugs, who's killing whatever. And, but on the surface, he's got a public face. He's giving money to, an orphanage, et cetera, et cetera. But it's weird. People don't make the connection. They think, oh, that's fiction. That's, then no, that's exactly how it works. Right.
I'm coming in to save Patagonia. You know what I'm saying? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Fantastic ideas from tonight. The questions are off the charts. We're going to be taking a few more of your questions and then we're out. But it's going to be a great Memorial Day weekend for everyone. And this is X Series 127. We're talking about the Noah's Ark and how that relates to some of the Cayce Atlantis Amilius work and what that DNA mystery is all about. We covered a good deal of it, but I can tell you, whenever I get into this subject, there are hours and hours that we could do together, and we will, to get to some of those answers. And that's the kind of stuff that we're looking for. Okay, Miss Olivia, you're up. We'll do 5 more minutes of questions.
Okay, Caritas Tarot. Did Steiner ever discuss or predict a golden age in the future?
He did. Well, he also predicted the war of all against all. And we have to understand, I think, where he's coming from with it. So he's basically saying, look, humanity is facing off against this harmonic eighth sphere activity. And humanity can get through it and evolve properly and create New Jupiter, which is the same thing as New Jerusalem. It's a kind of cosmology, but there's an ideal in the Bible that's about New Jerusalem. So New Jupiter is where the Steiner cosmology draws us in. What's happening is the harmonic groups want to continue to control humanity. They don't want us to evolve past their ability to control us. So they've set up artificial steps of development. And so we have to understand the complexity of those things. All I can say to make it easy and accessible is something like a virtual reality realm, where we're just sucked in with our imagination thinking we're doing a particular thing. That's why it's so important when we get around the eighth sphere to understand it for this period. Remember, Steiner had said that the eighth sphere was the top secret of the mystery schools, and its knowledge being prematurely put out was actually kind of disastrous. Why was that? What it is about the eighth sphere? I think what he put down was that we can't go into this eighth sphere dream and go backward in our development, shut off from our spiritual evolution into just some kind of scientific materialism daydream that Armand creates with all our thoughts and pleasures and everything else. There's plenty of thoughts and pleasures to be had in a conscious, aware state without all the harmonic eighth sphere stuff. So we have to be, we see it around us at all times. And the whole surveillance thing and the smart cities and, the whole thing about, you can only drive 20 miles and then we'll shut off your car and things like that. It's a control thing for you to live inside and to feed it. Remember this wonderful Frankenstein version of Bill Gates? And it was actually, I went down and checked this out. It's a real literal patent that he has, which was to have a human being, an object placed inside of you so that you could generate energy for Bitcoin, to develop Bitcoin. That's an actual patent. They haven't used it. It's not on the market
Yet.
But that's a patent that they have. So that's how they think of you. Can I stick something in you to generate Bitcoin energy? Because, by the way, all these people who champion Bitcoin and everything else, that's an environment destroyer, by the way, because it uses so much energy. And also, it's a centralizer. It's not a decentralizer, unfortunately. We need to have something that does decentralize, but it ain't Bitcoin. So, these are things that we just have to be frank about, and also not to be too culty about, and no, you can't talk about Bitcoin because I worship Bitcoin or something. Everything's on the table, and we're going to discuss it like adults, and we're going to see where we get with it. I like the idea of decentralized currency. Unfortunately, as they've shown just recently, they can demolish you in a heartbeat if you are centralized into their digital economy. So we certainly need better solutions than that. Yes.
Okay.
I wish that was a better, more upbeat answer, but hey.
Shashakila, quote, God gave Noah the rainbow sign, saying no more water, but the fire next time. And a cult fan, so basically God is done with the flood and Earth will be destroyed by fire. So I want to get into that. A cult fan, how long does the Amilius Group Mystery School say the world will last? What is the great cycle in years between when the world is totally burned and then flooded and reborn again?
It's pretty interesting. It's funny. I remember Cayce talking about how many of the battlefields during World War II were going to be where the new groups did their own trade, and that meant that there was going to be dramatic earth changes in places that were above ground. In one of Cayce readings, there's the whole thing about Japan disappearing. So we're going to see massive earth changes in the period that we're in, and that relates directly to things like food and community, and energetically, it's a huge thing. You can imagine if a place like California went completely underwater, the psychic shock of that to a place like America. So we have to be aware of these things. But I think that the mystery schools have given us the opportunity to look at that information and say, this can help you when these things start to happen, to understand that they're happening for a reason. And there's a whole thing in the Cayce work about safety lands, and where he talked about how Livingston, Montana, and Saskatchewan in Canada would someday feed the world, along with portions of South Africa. I'm very sure that's one of the reasons why the Summit Lighthouse Church Triumphant Universal Elizabeth Clare Prophet work went there to Livingston, Montana. But why? Why is it Livingston, Montana is going to feed the world? I think these are great questions. So I think that the mystery schools give us some hints, and they give us some idea of things to come. But I don't feel that they've given, the date of, how long things will last on a particular theme, on a particular timeline. And I also think there's a weird thing that I want to get into on this, which is if you go into Ouspensky's work, he talks about how the conditions themselves that you're in change depending on how you change. This is deep, and it also reminds me of something that Cayce says in this regard as well, which is that, if 50 people, this is before Pearl Harbor, if 50 people got together at the Cayce Foundation and prayed, then there wouldn't be any invasion of the United States. So what does that tell you? It's a remarkable power that he's referring to, and it's a remarkable intention. So if we take that and extrapolate it out for a moment and we start to say, if my thoughts are different, in fact, the conditions I'm in are changing too. So it changes the conditions of life, in fact. So in fact, this change does happen one person at a time. So this idea that things are horribly, completely out of control and the Davos crowd is running things and they're going to nuke us and all the rest of it, I don't doubt that they have plans like that. But I think with each one of us as a conscious antenna, that the outcome can be very different. That would be the way that I would think about that. That's an excellent question, however. Okay, one more, Miss Olivia, and you're up.
Actually, it's not a question. I just wanted to say it because it is Memorial Day weekend.
Yes.
So I wanted to let Erin Aktas have the last word. Thank you to all veterans who lost their lives and the families who must live without them. Have a very safe and blessed Memorial Day.
Oh, wow. Think about that. Absolutely.
So
yeah.
let's not
Memorial
forget.
Day. Never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot. Let's not forget. I always think of John Kennedy for Veterans Day because he was a hero, and he was a hero in World War II, and he was also a hero when he became president. A couple of quick things before we leave, but to all the veterans out there, thank you. I'm there with you, and I believe in that kind of honorable. And my dad was really, saw live combat, and he learned a great deal from the inhumanity from that to be a lot more humane himself. I'm going to close with a Steiner quote, and then I'll leave it to you if you have one more. Here's something to think about during the time of Noah, Steiner. At that time, the air was saturated with water mist vapors. Man lived in the water mist, which in certain regions never lifted to the point where the air was completely clear. Sun and moon could not be seen as they are today, but were surrounded by colored coronas. A distribution of rain and sunshine, such as occurs in the present, did not exist at that time. So it's very interesting because it's almost like we were coming out of a kind of consciousness and into a different consciousness. So this is another echo of Noah's work. And with that, I am going to leave X-127, the series episode, for you. It's been great having you here.
I have some super chatters to thank.
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. Global Atlantis, a cult fan, Stephen, Catherine Amelia, Eurythmia's Fun, Jim Sarge 3ID, Bob Bindert, Leshat, Jay Vanderbest, Bill Monahan, CD Callio, Tango Liberty, Joe Sampson, Erica Swenson Elliott, Tricky Vicky, Dorian Hewitt, Roosevelt Media News, Luke Walker, Gil and Joy R, Esoteric Fairy Tales, Zachary Moser, Jordan Romu, and Sarah Jane. Thank you so much.
Wow, we really appreciate your support. Thank you for everything that you do for us in this program. We can't do these remarkable shows for you without your support. So thank you to all of our supporters tonight and to our subscribers. We have some incredible things coming up for you this summer, and I'm looking forward to us all being a part of it. And like I said, I think it's a lot of that conversation with us in the Ideas Room is the exact reason for censorship, and that they don't want these types of conversations to happen, because I think they make all the difference. And, they don't want you to see Rata, for example. It's Rata censorship. But it's been fantastic being with everyone tonight. I'll do a couple of shout outs myself. And Metamorphosis. Thank you, DJ and Miss Olivia. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Olivia, you did an outstanding job. Bravo, everyone. A round of applause for Miss Olivia. And Together We Rise, Love to All. That's fantastic. Wow, this is going so fast. Jewel of Aquarius. Great name. Fantastic. Wow. Incredible. Golden Girl. Fix It Fast. Luke Walker. Let's see. I think I've got you, Luke Walker. Boom. Fantastic show. Thank you very much, Olivia and DJ, for your important work. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Outrageously great. Another sweet show. I like that. It's straight, it's simple.
Mhm.
Another sweet X show. It's X-127, baby. Great show, Olivia and DJ. Gracias. Najat, good night. Great to see you out there. Wow, the gang's all here. Terrific. God, Truth, War. B. Nickel. DJ, I'd love an X series going deep on the Arthurian legend. Absolutely.
Great idea.
There's so much in it that really resonates right now. We need a lot of the Knights of the Round Table. If you're out there, we need you now. Let me tell you. Fix It Fast. Wally Tango Foxtrot. Fantastic. Elizabeth, Aaron, Nick Malone. Time to get drunk. Interesting.
That's not disciplined.
I'm going to hit that lemonade hard.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much. Crystal Spirit. Excellent. Wow. Absolutely fantastic crowd tonight. Steiner Degata. Thank you. God bless. Tina. Thank you. And God bless you. Dash Render. Yes. Yeah, it's coming. There's some very special episodes coming. I can tell you it's going to be a wild ride. Steiner's telling of Rosicrucian beginning is similar to the Arthurian legends. It is true. There's that echo of Arthur, and it is the Holy Grail and the quest and the Knights of the Round Table. It's all there, and it's kind of a pattern to be activated, and it was the pattern of a fair time. And I think that's why the Kennedy administration is called Camelot. He listened to Camelot, but there is that fair time he was bringing back. And I think we have to remember the Kennedy Camelot time as well.
Yeah, if anybody has not seen Excalibur, I recommend it highly.
Unbelievable.
It's one of
Incredible.
my favorite films.
Crystal Spirit, thank you. Cove Channel. Michael Winstonley, Leslie Pattern, Kay Grace, Eric Actus. Wow, great crowd. Chrissy, you're out there. Chrissy, you got dreams? What's going on there? Thank you so much, DJ and Olivia. Let's see. Chrissy's dream. I've had 2 dreams about a dinner party with DJ, Olivia, and Gigi. So see you at the next astral dinner. We'll be there, party. Haha, I remember seeing a church out the window, out a building. Interesting. Well, we know it's coming. And it'll be great to be there. Love me some Merlin, says Enlo. Fantastic. The Ideas Room is just hopping tonight. It's so great to see everyone out there. And we will see you all next week. And have a fantastic Memorial Day. Probably some very special reports coming up. Don't forget 2 Eyes Stone. There it is. And we probably are going to do some special reports between now and then. I might do something actually right around Memorial Day with all the craziness coming out around the Department of Homeland Security taking over the UFO file. Got to watch that trend like a hawk. But we will see you all next week, and have a great night. Fantastic Rocket Ideas Room. And it says end broadcast, but it never really ends. Pat Kelly, Aaron, Kate, Don Neway, Cove Channel, Tim Houston, Golden Girl. Wow, unbelievable. Thanks so much. And as I said, it says end broadcast, but
Never really ends.
it's hard to beat.
God bless everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great Memorial Day weekend. We'll see you soon.